I'm going to hop in Discord. Welcome. This will be episode 26 of Agent Smith World Discussion. We have the powerful and amazing Fuzzy Cord, who is handing along questions. This is a live discussion. Agent Smith tends to say a few more words than me, but I can talk to him and you can talk to him. Asking questions in the chat, Fuzzy Cord will hand those along to him if they are appropriate and excellent. It's snowing. Wow. Share. Share. Let's rock it. Let's roll it. Welcome, Agent Smith.
Oh, hey. How you
dude.
doing?
Well, our AC broke, so it's hotter than heck fire in here. How are you?
Oh, your AC broke.
Yeah.
Well, that's inconvenient.
Yeah, especially as a Texan.
Well, it's probably not too bad right now, is it?
Well, yeah, it's in the 70s, so we opened up the windows, but it did get up to 90 today.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, you gotta get that fixed.
Yeah, it's not the first time we've had an issue. One of the previous times, there was an ant colony that was in the AC unit. It's actually a pretty common problem because they like that environment. It's a lot more damp than outside of the AC unit.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yeah, we'll survive.
Yeah, you gotta get the apartment guy on that.
Yeah. How was your week?
It's quiet. It's just working on the podcast, reading news, and trying to figure out the StarCraft editor.
Yeah.
Still trying to figure that out.
How was this week? Did any amazing things happen? I feel like there wasn't anything as signaling as the Koreas talking to each other. Oh, they did change their time zone. That was a thing.
Yeah, a little gesture,
Mm-hmm.
little minor signal to the South Koreans. Like, we love you.
Mm-hmm.
Don't be mad. Don't worry, we won't kill you. Probably.
We'll set our clocks with you. That's how intimate this is getting.
Yeah, there wasn't a whole lot going on this week. Nothing really dramatic. Nothing particularly important was blown up, so not a lot of sexy news headlines to go with.
I did watch a video of a couple people having Trump's daily diet. It's 12 Diet Cokes per day. That is pretty amazing.
A lot of Diet Coke.
Yeah. Lots of Diet Coke, cheeseburgers, Egg McMuffin in the morning, some well-done steaks for dinner. He has pizza with the toppings, like, shaved off, so it's none of the bread and crust and stuff. And it's eaten with a knife and fork. It's very strange.
Huh.
Yeah.
That's pretty exotic.
Yeah. It's exotic, but it's very American. Like, what is being consumed is American. I think it's the way he consumes it that is exotic.
Yeah.
He's got to distinguish himself from the lower classes, you know?
Well, I can't say my diet is a great deal better, so I'm not in much position to complain.
Yeah. Well, I had a cheeseburger yesterday, so...
Cheeseburgers are pretty good.
Yep.
Hard to say no.
He must have
I think
excellent
this week I
positions.
did notice that almost every day I was reading at least one article about somebody begging Donald Trump not to abandon the nuclear deal with Iran.
Mm-hmm.
That was a pretty common theme the past week, if not also before. He'll probably do it. So if you're hoping he doesn't, you're probably going to be disappointed. But I don't think it'll be too substantive a change. It kind of depends on what the administration wants to do with it. If the United States government ends up applying swift banking sanctions, again, as they had before the nuclear deal, that'll be a big problem, and that would almost certainly scupper the deal and set everything back to square one. But on the other hand, if the administration doesn't do that, if instead they just do more targeted sanctions, kind of like what they've already been doing, since the nuclear deal was signed. In that case, there probably won't be a substantive change. The real power behind the nuclear deal is the other countries that are participating, not just the United States, but also India, China, Russia, Europe, etc. And if they're not buying into an abandonment of the deal, and if they stick with it, and if the United States doesn't use SWIFT banking sanctions as a bludgeon to try to coerce them away from continuing the deal, then they'll probably just continue the deal without the United States participating. And it would probably, for the most part, still be workable. There would still be some issues, but it would be a bit more difficult for Iranian economic actors to do business, but it's already pretty difficult. So it wouldn't necessarily be a dramatic change if they did it without implementing SWIFT banking sanctions again. So the nuclear deal probably will just continue to go on. If the United States pulls out, it'll probably be more of a superficial symbolic change. It won't really bring substantive pressure to bear against Iran. More pressure, yes, but I don't think it'll be so much that it's going to make them want to abandon the deal themselves, especially if they still have willing partners in Europe, China, Russia, etc. Let's see, and I think there were a couple of things. I think actually after we finished last Sunday, I read a headline about airstrikes in Syria, probably carried out by Israel, although they haven't, I don't think they took credit for them explicitly. They denied knowing anything about it, but that's pretty much the Israeli MO. If there's mystery airstrikes somewhere in the Middle East and nobody takes credit for them, that's generally Israel. So that kind of represented a pretty strong signal that Israel, assuming again that it was Israel, that would send a pretty strong signal that they're going to be more involved in Syria going forward, that they're taking a stronger line as far as Iran's presence, and I think it was mostly Iranian targets that they hit in Syria. So the Israelis may be gearing up to apply more pressure on Iranians in Syria to try to make sure that whatever course the conflict takes going forward, it doesn't end with Iranian forces in Syria on the border with Israel. They want to make sure that Iran does not have a significantly greater presence in Syria than it did before the conflict. Ideally none, although that's probably a stretch at this point. But at the very least, they want to mitigate it to some degree. And they may well work with the Saudis to do that. There's kind of a budding Saudi-Israeli alliance kind of emerging, more of a strategic alliance, and they try to keep it low-key, because of course a lot of people still have issues about with the Palestinian issue, but the Saudis and the Israelis have a common foe in Iran, and they're probably going to start working together more, if indeed Israel does want to become more active in Syria. So that was an interesting new signal to interpret, but there hasn't been much traction on that since then, so it's hard to tell whether or not that's going to be a regular thing, or if that was just more of a one-off, that they had something in particular they wanted to blow up.
Well, it seems like Syria is one of those kind of contested territories where the power players in the area can kind of leverage some influence and leave their mark, so to speak, as opposed to a more stable region where it doesn't make sense to intervene and muck about. I guess an exception that comes to mind from recent memory would be Crimea. It seemed like that was basically stable, and then there was a dispute that was created where they kind of make a wedge. We're here now. This is ours. Okay.
Well, there was a degree of stability. Yeah, I mean, people were okay with the status quo, but there had been a sentiment beforehand that they were able to exploit. You know, strategic rivalry between Iran and Israel was a little different than Russia having some ambitions vis-a-vis Crimea. That was more of a opportunity knocks type thing, more so than a long-running strategic goal. You know, that was after the what was it, Sochi Olympics, I think, in 2014. It's about the same time as the Maidan Revolution, and then when that whole situation deteriorated, the Russian government, you know, made their play, so to speak. I mean, the United States wasn't going to do anything. They were pretty confident about that, and they were right. And the Europeans, of course, weren't going to do anything. So why not? Easy pickup for them. And a lot of people in the Crimea wanted to be a part of Russia anyway. Not all of them, but probably a majority. It's probably a pretty legitimate desire.
Enough that they had a legitimate base to kind of springboard off of with the rationale that, no, the people of the region want this to happen. Look, we found some of them.
Yeah, I mean, Russia has had a major naval base there for a long time, and, you know, like any large base that's been around a long time, a community grew up around it. So a lot of that area and surrounding parts of Crimea are populated by people who had been in the Russian military at one point or another. And obviously those people are pretty keen on the idea of Crimea being a part of Russia. It's no stretch for them. Yeah, the Tatar population might not particularly like it, but there's not that many of them, I don't think. Maybe 10% of the population, if that. And there's a smattering of Ukrainians, too. They have mixed feelings about it. I don't think there's enough sentiment there against being a part of Russia to really overturn it. Well, anyway, that's kind of getting off on a tangent. Yeah, it's a little bit analogous to Syria in that, you know, there's a conflict that emerges and gives a pre-existing issue a new way to manifest. So with the Israelis and the Saudis, it's with the Israelis and the Iranians, rather, it's their rivalry that's manifesting through the new conflict. And in Russia, it's a little different, but yeah, the instability in Ukraine kind of opened that door. And then another thing I noticed this past week, there was steel tariffs, the steel and aluminum tariff thing. The U.S. strategy, so to speak, is kind of emerging as far as how it's managing that. And it looks like what they're trying to do is kind of like a redux of what was done with Japan in the 1980s. There was a lot of consternation on the part of the United States in the 1980s about the growth of the Japanese economy and how it was kind of eating into U.S. market share, and, you know, especially Japanese automakers and electronics companies were starting to predominate, such that it was becoming an issue in the United States. And some of that was due to just competitiveness on their part and a lack of competitiveness on the part of American firms, but there was some truth to the accusation that Japanese firms were getting unfair assistance from the Japanese government in the form of Japanese industrial policy, which gave them little advantages here and there, you know, devalued currency, favorable taxes, you know, de facto coordination between economic actors, that kind of thing. And so the United States government, under the Reagan administration, strong-armed the Japanese government, well, maybe not strong-armed, but leaned on them to agree to implement an export quota. So the Japanese government, as a result of that, actually passed, purposely limited the amount of cars that it could export to the United States. I don't know if that agreement is still in place, but at that time, that was what they agreed to do as a result of American pressure. And it wasn't necessarily a bad deal for them, because you know, they couldn't sell as many cars, but because the supply was restricted, the price went up. So while they weren't selling as many, they were able to sell them at a higher price, so they didn't really make too much of a loss there. Really, it just raised prices in the United States, pretty much. So the Trump administration seems to be trying to take a similar tact as far as negotiating with other countries regarding exemptions from the new steel and aluminum tariff that it wants to implement. And basically, the quid pro quo is that if they agree to basically a quota, then they'll get an exemption. But if not, then they have to agree to a tariff. So there's not really any third way for them, basically. There's going to be restrictions of some kind or another. But the quota system seems to be the preferred tool. That's kind of what the United States government is pushing. And thus far, from what I read, South Korea agreed to it, although they didn't really have to give up much. They did have to make some concessions on access to their automotive market, but the general consensus is that they were not substantive concessions, probably more symbolic. And then Brazil also supposedly has an agreement. The administration says it has an agreement in place, but the Brazilian government says it doesn't. And then they weren't particularly pleased with what was offered either. And then I think Australia has an exemption now too. I haven't read as much about that. The European negotiations are ongoing, and those are probably not going to end anytime soon. I would expect that the countries where the steel industry is relatively more important to the economy and relatively more important as a political actor are probably the countries that are going to agree to quotas without too much fuss. So Brazil, Australia, and South Korea are kind of examples of that, where steel is an important export industry. Or in South Korea, where it's just a part of their industrial policy. It's important politically. But in Europe, it's not as important, so I don't think they're going to be as willing to negotiate. They're probably going to take a harder line and implement retaliatory tariffs if the United States does go ahead with the tariff regime. And then also the Mexico and Canada also are negotiating exemptions, and that's a big mess because that's overlapping with the NAFTA renegotiation. And the Trump administration is saying that, if they don't agree to a better, basically make concessions in the NAFTA renegotiation, then the exemptions will not be given. So it's kind of being used as a tool to pressure Canada and Mexico to give in on certain issues with regard to NAFTA, which they don't like and could end up being a problem because Mexico has some elections coming up, and we talked a little bit about a week ago, and I was actually surprised since then to find that Obrador is actually leading in the polls as far as the upcoming Mexican election. And Obrador is a bit of a populist himself. So there could be some fireworks if Obrador wins the election and ends up leading the negotiation with the Trump administration as far as NAFTA renegotiation. That could be very colorful, to put it mildly. But that's a couple months away, I think. So we'll see. There's still time. But I don't think the negotiation as far as the exemptions is going to have any traction until after the Mexican Mexican elections. Neither will NAFTA, for that matter, the NAFTA renegotiation. So we'll have to wait and see just what the implications they are. But long story, basically, to make the original point, the Trump administration is trying to use that tariff issue in the NAFTA renegotiation, and that's not going to be resolved soon. So for Brazil, Australia, and South Korea, it's kind of a done deal. That's been hashed out. But Canada, Mexico, and the European Union, all of those negotiations for exemptions are ongoing and are not set to close anytime soon. It's an interesting strategy on the part of the Trump administration to take. Not because it's like really innovative per se, but I'm not really sure what the point is, basically. I mean, nominally there's the national security rationale for the United States needs a indigenous, so to speak, steel and aluminum industry for, certain key industries sensitive to national security, as well as for the production of military equipment, aircraft, vehicles, what have you. But I hadn't really had the impression that the steel industry was under such threat that it wouldn't be able to continue to service its role as producer of raw materials, basically, for national security production of one sort or another without a protectionist regime in place. Certainly they were losing grounds as far as the private sector, but I would have thought that public sector consumption would have been enough to keep them afloat in the long term, even. I could be wrong on that, but that was my impression. So it seemed like a pretty flimsy argument to me to say that it was really just needed for national security reasons. The dumping argument was more feasible, that the Chinese government has facilitated through economic policy a huge glut in steel production. I could see that, and so certain measures could be taken there, but I don't know how much this is really going to help in that regard. And that's more of a global problem than specifically an American problem. But I guess if you really want to bump the steel industry in the United States, and the aluminum industry for that matter, then this is a decent enough excuse. I mean, if you just want an excuse to do it, this is a pretty good one. It gives you some nice cover. I think partly it's more political than it is economic, though. I suspect that the principal impetus is not so much economic and lending stimulus to these industries. I suspect it's more about kind of winning the support of certain constituents. You know, certain areas of the United States where the steel and aluminum industry are prominent have wanted this kind of move, this kind of protectionist measure for a long time, and so they're probably quite pleased with it. But in that sense, it's more patronage, basically. Patronage network building than it is economic policy making. Kind of buying the support of special interest and constituents. And on the one hand, in the short to medium term, that'll be good for those communities because they'll get a nice stimulus that they haven't been able to get in a long time. That'll help them out. But on the downside, their economic interests are going to be defined more by politics than the economy going forward. So that's going to be a vested interest. They'll have a vested interest in maintaining this regime in place. And whether or not they can keep it in place is pretty debatable. Because in future, if a different political coalition comes to power in the United States that does not include them, then a lot of these trade protections are probably going to go. Because there's going to be pressure from other parts of the economy, other producers who want cheap steel and who don't have a problem with steel dumping per se. Those economic actors are going to pressure any new government to get rid of these trade restrictions. And if that happens, then these communities are going to be in trouble. So I would think the better long-term policy would be to try to create new policies that adjust to the economic realities of the modern world competition, global competition. And you know, that's not going to mean like a completely open free market. You know, there are issues there certainly, but you know, the temporary protectionist measures like these are fleeting generally. They're pretty temporary. So it might give people a false sense of security that comes back to bite them later. It's more of a short-term fix than a long-term fix. There were structural fundamental issues in the U.S. steel industry before they started to struggle, you know, before the Chinese steel dumping, and those have not yet really been addressed. And I would be curious going forward to see just how the U.S. steel industry responds to getting protectionist measures. It could be an opportunity for them to take those extra profits they get and reinvest in their businesses in order to try to make them more competitive. But there may also then be a temptation to just take those profits and absorb them, and to not really invest in the business again. And you know, that would kind of portray a sense that they're not really, that even they don't really expect to be competitive going forward, and that this is more of a short-term fix than a long-term fix. Something to watch, basically.
Cool. Steel. Why should we care? Who benefits? Who is harmed? I don't know anything about steel.
Well, if you're a steel producer, certainly protectionist measures benefit you. That's higher prices for you, more demand from trade diverting demand, basically. But you know, again, that depends entirely on whether or not the protectionist measures stay in place, and that's going to be a political question, not an economic question. Yeah, that's the trouble with trade protection. It creates problems politically because you have voters basically who have an incentive to vote for whoever will promise to protect their interests, specifically the protectionist measures. This was a problem in places like Latin America, which tried a import substitution development strategy in the mid-20th century, where they were trying to produce as much of the goods that they consumed as possible, rather than importing. The trouble with that is that it required a lot of borrowing. You know, there was a lot of things that they couldn't produce themselves, and so they ended up borrowing themselves into a debt crisis in the 1980s, and then the whole thing fell apart. And it might not have been so bad, except for the fact that the infant industries that they tried to start, the new industries that they tried to create by having protectionist measures and trying to develop their economy with those infant industries, a lot of them did not become competitive. Without the competitive pressure of international markets or even large internal markets, they never really felt any need to become competitive. You know, they felt with the protections in place, they could kind of be inefficient, take shortcuts, and basically not make money effectively without any consequence. And you know, there really weren't any until the debt crisis happened and the government couldn't afford to subsidize them anymore. And at that point, not only did the country's debt have a debt crisis, but the industries in question lost the support they needed to stay viable, and a lot of them went under. There were a few that made it through, but a lot of them didn't, and it created a lot of broader economic problems. But to get back to the original point, because these industries were in place, because these industries employed a lot of people, and because they had a lot of political connections, there was not a lot that political reformers could do to try to push them to become competitive. Once they were relatively large, employed a lot of people, it became almost impossible for anybody to really propose to reduce protectionist measures to try to encourage them to be more efficient, such that they were not leeching the public purse, basically, where the government wasn't spending so much money trying to subsidize them and keep them viable. And again, that eventually led to an implosion, basically, a disequilibrium. So there is a danger of that happening with protectionist measures anywhere of any sort, not just with regard to an import substitution strategy. And the political complications can be very difficult to unwind. For example, in the future, if if some other political force wins the next election for president and gets power in Congress in the United States, and they don't feel any particular need to protect the steel and aluminum industry, and they feel more beholden to economic actors who don't want protections for steel, who want cheaper steel and imported steel. If they get into power and they basically just remove all of these protections, and they hypothetically, in this hypothetical example, they would be able to do that. That would create a lot of consternation and an economic dislocation in those communities, and it would create a lot of political division. Because of course people would ask, why are we throwing these people under the bus? Why, they're Americans, they're producing American steel, we should protect them, etc., etc. So it creates a new political cleavage in the political system, basically. And you wouldn't have needed it if you didn't really have the protections in the first place. Again, I'm not saying that protections are not always needed, or that protections are never needed. There's never any circumstances in which they're warranted. Whether or not present circumstances warranted is subjective. That kind of comes down to your personal politics. But there is this kind of political danger there of political patronage networks in place. And the steel and aluminum industry are not the only political actors in the United States acceptable to this. You can see this in other forms as well. But with regard to trade policy in particular, this is how that's manifesting there.
Consternation is a good word. QQ actually taught me that. And he bore upon his face a look of consternation. Oh, what does that mean?
Let's see. So there was one more thing that kind of caught my eye, and then I'll kind of dig into the questions that are starting to come in. Let's see. So yeah, the other thing that caught my eye this week was protests in France. The French government is trying to reform their labor laws, basically, trying to have labor reform. And unsurprisingly, there's a lot of resistance to it. The Macron government has been pushing really hard, has as a priority the economic reform of France. The economy there has been struggling for a while, kind of stagnating, and kind of needs something to get it going again. It needs some kind of reform in order to generate economic activity and growth, such that people can basically have some opportunities available to them. There are some opportunities available, but a lot of them are kind of restricted to certain political actors. Basically people who have seniority in unions, or people who are otherwise connected, or of course, the elite, the economic and political elite, of course, always have a leg up in terms of the opportunities. But a lot of people, especially younger people, have trouble kind of finding their way in the economy there, as well as in other equivalent developed countries that have similar issues. And so Macron has proposed to try to deal with this by liberalizing the French economy. But there's a lot of political sentiment against that, because of course France is a relatively pro-labor country and has relatively pro-labor politics. And a lot of those pro-labor political actors have come out and have been protesting really hard against the latest reform package, which I think involves, I think the principal controversial element anyway, was raising the retirement age, which, never is popular. That's always a quick and easy way to piss people off. And it kind of comes on the heels of some larger reforms a while back. There was a much deeper reform that was passed a few months ago that changed a lot of the labor code in France. And I suspect that's probably the more important reform as far as what's driving discontent. The recent reform to raise retirement age is kind of more of a straw that broke the camel's back type thing. You know, there was already a lot of discontent from the previous reform, and now this additional reform has pushed people to kind of come out in a way that they hadn't before, even though the previous reform was much bigger. So it's important to watch because it'll kind of, how that plays out will determine the future of labor reform in France, and probably more broadly the degree to which it can reform its economy in a way that generates at least some economic growth, at least relatively more than what it's been experiencing the past 10, 20 years. So that'll be an important signal, an important marker as far as what happens to the French economy going forward, whether or not those reforms can go through, and if not, what alternative ends up kind of taking their place. It'll also say something about the ability of the Macron government to pass its agenda. That's always an important marker as far as judging the vitality and efficacy of a new government. And they're still relatively new. I don't think Macron's been in power all that long. So it'll be interesting to watch going forward. So yeah, those are kind of the four. Sorry, go ahead.
I think he was recently elected when we started doing this segment.
Yeah. Yeah, we've been doing this about a year now, haven't we?
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, time flies, doesn't it?
It does.
Rest in peace, Kukio.
Let's see, so what's your opinion for the Angola power transition to João Lourenço after decades of Eduardo dos Santos in power? I don't follow Africa much, so I generally don't have a whole lot to say about African affairs. It kind of, Africa in general doesn't get a lot of coverage, and it doesn't generally tie into overarching international issues that much, so it tends to fly under the radar. You know, Angola has been a de facto one-party state for decades under the MPLA, and that stems from the Angolan Civil War back in the 70s. And the current leadership, or I guess the previous leadership, had a reputation for hoarding the country's oil supply, oil revenue, basically. Angola is a major oil producer, and the government gets a good chunk of that revenue, and a lot of it ends up being kind of siphoned off by the ruling family. I think, I think the daughter of the president is supposed to be a billionaire or something to that effect, and she's probably younger than me, which is depressing. Yeah, they've done pretty well for themselves, the leadership in Angola on that count. So I'm a little skeptical that the transition of power is real. I mean, if they hold a free and fair election and there's a transition of power, more power to them. That's certainly a good sign for Angolan political culture. But an entrenched political interests in a one-party state generally don't give up power very easily. So even if they are not in power themselves, they probably still have enough political connections to political parties, the bureaucracy, as well as economic clout. You know, they still got an immense reserve of economic resources built up, I'm sure. With all of those levers of influence, they could easily kind of manage things from behind the scenes, even if they're not directly in office anymore. So I'm a little bit skeptical then that there's been a real transition of power, and I haven't really heard much as far as improving governance or democratic institutions in Angola. Again, I haven't been paying much attention, so that, you know, maybe there has been and I just didn't see it. But, you know, it's given that the current ruling family, such as it is, has been in power for so long, is so wealthy and powerful, and given that how much money is at stake, you know, given that we're talking about oil revenues, which are generally pretty large, I would be pretty reluctant. I would be pretty skeptical that they would just kind of walk away. So probably there won't be substantive change going forward, would be my guess. But again, that would just be a guess. I'd have to read more about it to say more than that. Angola is an interesting case study. They used to be a colony of Portugal. They had Angola, and then they had Mozambique. I think those were their major colonies in Africa. Then in the 60s, I think, I want to say in the late 60s and then early 70s, there was a big revolution And Portugal ended up fighting this long, dragged-out counterinsurgency in Angola and Mozambique against what were basically African nationalists, Angolan or Mozambique nationalists, but probably also Pan-Africanists. And I don't know how many people really know that. You know, that I think people were more focused at the time on Vietnam, which was the more well-known counterinsurgency conflict. But Portugal fought its own equivalent in Africa at the time. Pretty brutal at times, from what little I've read about it. And that went on until 1975, I think, when Angola became Angola. Well, basically, all of Portugal's colonies got independence in '75, I think. I think they that was when they had the new government in. I can't remember what it was called. They had some special name for their revolution that it kind of overthrew the authoritarian government and replaced it with more democratic institutions. Or maybe it was a protest that pushed the authoritarian government to reform. Again, don't quite remember. But after that happened, they gave up on the colonies, and that was the end of the conflict. But then Angola entered a new stage of conflict in which different factions of the rebellion turned on each other. Basically, there was a socialist faction that aligned more with the Soviet Union, and then there was another socialist faction that didn't want to share power with them, and then there was a pro-Western faction backed by the United States. And they all started fighting with each other. I think the MPLA was the socialist government that aligned with the Soviet Union, and they're the ones that were able to take power pretty much immediately. They were pretty much the government from independence forward. And they fought a long civil war against the other two factions to try to solidify that. CIA kind of got its hands dirty supporting the pro-Western faction. I think that was UNITA, if I'm remembering correctly. It was kind of a grody group. Did a lot of killings and assassinations and torture and that kind of thing. I'm not as familiar with the other faction, though, that third faction. I do think that the Cubans got involved at one point, which kind of shows how exotic a conflict it was. The Cuban government actually sent troops to help fight with the MPLA. And they ended up fighting against South Africans, because at one point in the conflict, South Africa got involved and, I think secretly, sent a contingent of troops to try to help the rebels overthrow the MPLA government, so that there was not a Soviet-aligned government in southern Africa. So the CIA, South Africa, basically versus MPLA and Cubans. Interesting little conflict. And the Cubans did it pretty well. They actually beat the South Africans, I think, in a significant turning point, at a significant battle, and that pretty much had things under control from that point on. Even after that, though, I think the conflict dragged out for 20 years? Something to that effect. But 75 up until sometime in the 90s, I think, is when the peace deal was finally agreed to. So it hasn't, Angola hasn't really been at peace that long. I guess it's only been 20 years now or so. They've mostly been making money from oil revenues, but I think the rest of the economy hasn't quite recovered fully from the conflict. I think they're kind of still getting there, at least trying to.
One thing that's always seemed kind of arbitrary from an American perspective is when you see one of those maps of the colonialism in Africa and like which country was involved where. It looks very random. Like, oh, Portugal got this, Germany's here, Britons have these, French took these. It's like, okay, what is the reason for this particular progression? Is there a reason? Kind of just seemed like a rush of like whatever you can stake a claim on.
Now again, I'm not too much of an Africa guy, but from what I remember, it started on the coasts, more in the 1600s and 1700s. Trading posts, mostly, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody was really able to push much into the interior because of disease and the climate. You know, Europeans couldn't really handle it.
Mm-hmm.
So for the most part, they just stuck to the coast for a while, and it was mostly commercial rather than direct political control. And it was later in the late 1800s when technology had improved. Basically, medicine had improved to allow Europeans to kind of push deeper into Africa without, you know, dying of malaria or something. And when that happened, there was a big push. Part of that was also just international politics. You know, imperialism was very much in vogue. Explicit imperialism was in vogue in Europe in the late 1800s in a way that it hadn't really been before. You know, European empire had been a thing before the late 1800s, but it had traditionally been more a commercial empire. There hadn't always been a lot of direct political control. You know, Spain and Portugal being the exception. And you know, they started getting more control, but generally it was under the control of companies rather than countries per se.
East India Trading Company.
Yeah, East India Trading Company, Dutch East India Trading Company, etc. It was kind of more in the mid-19th century when the company rule gave way to direct political control. That was partly because of some scandals, you know, people back home being upset at the way the company was running things, thinking they weren't doing enough to improve the population, in other words, Christianizing them, you know, that kind of thing. And then there, of course, there was the Sepoy revolts in India in the, what, 1857, 1860, something around there. It was a major revolt of Indians against company rule. And they barely were able to kind of suppress it, and people in Britain were, well, the people in Britain were most upset with the Indians because they almost saw it as treason, because they saw India as being a part of the British Empire. But the people were also mad at the East India Company for letting it happen. They kind of blamed them for mismanaging India, and so there was legislation passed after that that basically passed control of India from the company to the British government, or at least explicitly to the British government. And so from that point, kind of from that mid-19th century period when imperialism became more political rather than economic, it became kind of fashionable almost. It became very popular. And so there was a sense that strong countries should push out into the world and have colonies. And that led to an impetus to kind of expand, where there hadn't really been much impetus before. You know, what is there in the heart of Africa that you just really need? Not a whole lot, but by the late 19th century, there was kind of an innate desire just to expand almost for the sake of expanding. Mm-hmm. There was also some, there was some economic incentive in that the industrial, what would it be? The second industrial revolution was kind of playing out in the late 1800s. So that also played a factor. There was a much greater need for natural resources, and so there was kind of some impetus to expand to try to gain control of potential sources of such natural resources. So you go into a place and stake a claim, not because you really wanted it, but because, you know, it's fashionable and because there might be resources there that your country or that some industry in your country could end up wanting to use. So that all kind of came together in the late 1800s, and there was a big push all at once, basically, to try to take bits of Africa. And it wasn't really all that random per se. It certainly looks random, but basically the British pushed up from South Africa, which they'd basically taken control of after, what was it, the Napoleonic War, I think. They took it from the Dutch. So they pushed up north from that, and then they pushed into the Nile. I think south from Egypt, but maybe from the Sudan. So kind of northwards and then southwards from the top of Africa. That was more sort of the British vector of approach. And if you look at a map of British colonial holdings in Africa, you can kind of see that. And then the French basically pushed east from West Africa, which was more their stronghold in Africa. And everybody else just kind of had bits and pieces. You know, the Portuguese had trading posts in Africa for a long time. They were some of the first to start up there. And you know, really they shouldn't have been able to hang on to them, because really bigger, larger empires should have been able to take them from them. But, you know, some trivia about Portugal. Portugal has one of the longest running alliances in history, presently. Not one of the longest running alliances ever, but let me put it like this, one of the longest ongoing alliances, and it's an alliance with the British. It was formed, I think, in the 1300s or something in that realm. And basically it's been in effect ever since. You know, it's not the most formal alliance always, but effectively the British and Portuguese kind of recognize it. And so because of that, the British never used their far superior naval power to try to take colonies from Portugal. It would have been easy to do, but it would have been diplomatically uncouth given the de facto alliance in place. So the Portuguese Empire was kind of able to persevere even past the point when Portugal was even remotely able to kind of defend its colonies. because they had help from the British and the British Empire. So Portuguese colonies in Africa around Angola, Mozambique, I think also Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, they basically just expanded out from those in the late 1800s in so much as they could. Pretty limited degree. There was a lot of compromise involved at the time, because there were some territories that hadn't been claimed, but that multiple countries claimed. And resolving that sometimes ended up with a third-party country being given control of the territory. So, for example, the Congo, everybody wanted the Congo, but nobody really had it at the time. And so the compromise was, let's just give it to the Belgians. So King Leopold basically kind of defaulted into Belgium. That's probably a gross simplification. Again, not an Africa guy. I haven't studied, the Treaty of Berlin or the corresponding events too deeply. And this is kind of just what I'm remembering roughly off the top of my head. The British do have some colonies in West Africa. I think Nigeria being the principal one. It's kind of a big win for them. But they were kind of limited in how much they could expand because the French were everywhere in West Africa. I do remember there was a big scramble for the Nile. The French tried to push east to it, and the British were able to kind of beat them there. Not by a whole lot, but enough to kind of get control.
It's interesting,
so roughly,
this whole progression is very... it kind of fits the attitude of the people in these regions should want this to happen because we're giving them so much awesome stuff because we're the best. As opposed to any kind of period of ethical consideration. What are the long-term implications of us occupying all these countries and basically making it a race to grab as much space in Africa as we possibly can? What are they up to?
Well, they probably would have justified it by saying the long-term implication is that they're civilized, that they experience economic development, and that they improve economically, politically, and socially. Mm-hmm. That was sort of the thinking at the time. There was a... the mid-late 19th century was very different than now. Mm-hmm. But it was also very similar in some ways. People had very strong convictions. One of the things that happened in the mid-19th century was a big religious awakening. I know it happened in the United States and Britain, and it probably happened in the rest of Europe too. And one of the results of that was a big increase in the conviction people had and the ethics of their predominant philosophy, that being Christianity, pretty much. And so, because people firmly believed that that was the right and true way to live, and that that was not only the right and true way to live, but the best way to live, and that it was conducive to personal growth, economic stability, economic dynamism, social stability, I mean, it was considered the bar for ethics. And furthermore, I should add, it was considered an objective bar for ethics. So it's not like they were saying, okay, they have their culture, they have their ethics, we have our culture, we have our ethics. The thinking was, ethics can be an objectively measured thing, and our ethics are objectively the best. And given that we believe that our ethics are objectively the best, would it not be wrong to try and spread them to others so that they also can enjoy them? So that they also can benefit, and so that the world as a whole can improve. So it was really a kind of utopian thinking. You know, it was a sense that the world could be made better by effort if they went out and spread their one true faith.
Mm-hmm. It seems like a strange step following the Enlightenment. Like it's kind of almost moving in the opposite direction. Because the Enlightenment, to me, it seemed like doubt was seen as a virtue. Like, to be open to doubting your belief system was a strength, as opposed to, in this case, it's a weakness. Mm-hmm. Your convictions are weak, therefore you're willing to admit that you might be wrong.
Mm-hmm. To a degree. Yeah, the Enlightenment was more about being skeptical and objective and whatnot, but mm-hmm. it also created a certain amount of hubris. Mm-hmm. You know, the level of economic development and the political sophistication of institutions that was achieved because of the Enlightenment kind of made Enlightenment thinkers a little bit full of themselves in a sense. Mm-hmm. There was kind of a sense that, oh yeah, skepticism is the way to go. You know, it went basically from be skeptical, challenge thinking, to we're the best, we're number one because we're skeptical.
Oh, right.
You know, so they applied that same kind of objective, they projected objectively, projected onto their predominant philosophy. And well, let me take a step back and try to clarify that. Some people were complaining from last week that I was being confusing and that I was listening to myself last week, and that was very true. I was chasing my tail a bit, so I want to try to be more clear going forward. Mm-hmm. So in the same way that people in the mid-19th century believed that their ethics were objectively the best, people from the Enlightenment kind of came to think that their thinking was objectively the best. And they cited as evidence all of the progress that was being made economically, scientifically, politically, etc. And so that kind of arrogance from the Enlightenment bled over into that sort of Great Awakening period in the 19th century. There was a sense that, okay, we have this skepticism, we have our Enlightenment thinking, and part of that, using that Enlightenment thinking, we draw the conclusion that our Christian philosophy and ethics are the best in the world and that we should spread them. This is kind of part of a tradition in Western culture, a trait of Western culture, if you will, where people feel compelled to proselytize, and that's a running theme almost throughout Western civilization. There has been this sense, certainly since the collapse of the Roman Empire, that there's an obligation to kind of spread your idea or your power or what have you. And it continues today. There's plenty of people who are evangelical believers in their preferred ideology today who feel the need to project that everywhere. It's kind of a new form of spreading Christianity, a new form of white man's burden. Mm-hmm. But it's the same theme. It's the same proselytizing behavior recurring over and over again, but manifesting in different ways. So part of that is just kind of an innate Western trait, in a sense, beyond just individual political factors or Enlightenment factor or what have you. Mm. Yeah, it's good to be skeptical. That's a good tradition to honor, but it's hard to always be skeptical. There was a time when skepticism basically resulted in racism. The church was more open to people of different races, not different cultures. The church obviously thought Christianity was the best religion, but it didn't really care about your race so much. Anybody could be Christian. Mm-hmm. They just need to be shown the way, so to speak. But Enlightenment thinkers started to kind of question that logic. They said that maybe not everybody is equal before God, and maybe the thought that they are is just church bullshit. Maybe that's just Christian dogma. Let's look past that. And so they tried to apply scientific method, and some of them took away some rather racist assumptions. Mm. So therein lies the rub with skepticism. It's good to be skeptical in order to challenge established ideas, but on the other hand, at some point you have to make a judgment call. And it can be troublesome if you make a judgment call without a lot of evidence.
Yeah. One thing that's funny as kind of a micro example of this is the different depictions of Jesus in Christianity, and how if you look at depictions of Jesus in China, he looks Chinese. If you look at depictions of Jesus in many countries in Africa, he looks African. If you look at the American or European Jesus, he looks European, Caucasian. Yeah. So it's one of those things where, yeah, people tend to perceive themselves as the most interesting and the most diverse and best culture because they have direct experience in seeing the breadth of their own culture because they're in the midst of it, as opposed to the greater your distance from a culture, the less you're likely to know about all the inner workings and the details within it. So you kind of oversimplify and you stereotype and you assume that it's worse and it's inferior in certain ways without any direct evidence of that.
Yeah, I think those are good points.
I think it's... If you went far enough back, it kind of seems like it could have been one of those evolutionary shortcuts that nature kind of built into us, which is it's better to trust your own tribe who you've lived with than to risk trusting an outside group that you don't really know what their day-to-day life is like. Because a lot of tribal living involved you wake up in your hut, you go outside to take a piss in the morning, you could get shot at by someone else. So it was a very different relationship in terms of trust and community and just peace versus violence. So the distrust is kind of a safety measure, you could say. Whereas nowadays, as the norms have changed and shooting people with a bow in the morning is not really fashionable anymore, now we don't really have to distrust each other that much. What'd you say?
It's frowned upon.
Yeah, generally it's frowned upon to shoot people with the bow in the morning. You should wait until at least mid-afternoon.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's also relevant that there's only so much knowledge that you can work with at a time, especially in an age when you don't really have a lot of information to work with in the first place. You know, if you're living in the 1700s or the 1800s, what have you, there's a pretty explicit limit to just how much knowledge is available to you, how much information is available to you. And, you know, you can be as objective and skeptical as you want, but limitations are limitations. And the nature of some of those limitations could steer you towards certain conclusions that if you had more information, you would not make, that you would not reach. So that's another problem with this proselytizing behavior in the West. You know, there's not a lot of information about other cultures, about other ethical systems, etc. There's a lot of knowledge about Western systems, about Western preferences and ethics. And kind of based on what limited knowledge they had of other cultures and European culture, the conclusion they reached was that, you know, scientifically speaking, ours is the best, so let's spread it around and then everybody will be happy and get along. Subsequent experience kind of disproved that, and, you know, there's been more maturation on that point. Although, who's to say it could turn around again? You never know.
Yeah.
We're kind of going through another evangelizing period of Western history currently. So that could, we could enter another imperial phase, although manifesting in a different way in the future. That'll be fun to watch.
It's one of those things that tends to ebb and flow. There's an overall trend, but if you look at the small scale, it kind of goes back and forth in certain ways. Because you get a lot of the push and pull of momentum of the different interest groups and stuff, where I think we can pretty safely say that governing is more difficult than opposing in certain ways, because you have to actually implement stuff, kind of as Paul Ryan infamously said. It's hard. It's hard governing. We don't have healthcare stuff. It's hard, guys.
Yeah.
But because of that, it's easier to critique and take issue and then kind of rally some opposition, so the opposition has a bit of an advantage. There's incumbent advantage, but it seems like there's also opposition advantage in that any governing group is going to be flawed. So it's not super hard to find out what the flaws of a group are and point them out.
Yeah, over the long term, you could say that opposition has the advantage. You know, it's kind of the difference between a stagnant defense and a dynamic defense. You know, if you just have a stagnant defense and you just keep it in place over the long term, then eventually your opponent is going to figure it out. Right. There's no way you're going to be able to maintain it. And a lot of political actors who have entrenched patronage networks, entrenched political power, etc., effectively they have what amounts to a political stagnant defense, in which political opponents are constantly trying to paw at them, trying to find the weaknesses, and eventually, at some point, maybe it takes 5, 20, 30 years, eventually they find it, and the regime isn't able to continue. This is one hell of a tangent for the Angola question.
Yeah! That's fun. Oh, as a reminder, this is... I'm kind of stealing a little bit of your thunder. We're not experts on everything that we talk about during this segment, and sometimes it is just two guys just kind of shooting the shit about a topic. So we can chase a tangent, but it's fun conversation at a certain point and not really super precision knowledge that we're dispensing. Like, your technical questions are good because sometimes you just know the answer and you can just tell them the answer.
Yep. The answer is X.
Next.
Bam.
Next question.
Let's see. What is the next one? I think we kind of covered the Angola thing. I guess the short answer is I don't really know, because I haven't read too much about Angola politics lately. Given how entrenched it, well, I'll let it go. Let it go and get it on another tangent doing that. If that answer is not entirely satisfactory, feel free to kind of elaborate, and we can kind of come, and I'll try to come back to it. What do you think of Erdogan's statements of military action against the Kurdish and his goals to make Turkey a global power? Okay. Yeah, I hadn't really hadn't really heard that. I don't really know how Turkey can become a global power. I think that might be a bit ambitious. If I had to guess, I would say it's just for the election. It's just election rhetoric. Turkey has an election coming up. It's kind of a high-stakes election in a way, in so much as it's going to kind of entome, maybe that's not the right word. Erdogan will be in power as the new president, and he's going to get a lot of new powers as a result of that. And that could have significant repercussions for Turkey going forward in terms of its governance, politics, etc. So Erdogan is kind of has been pulling out all the stops over the past couple months to try to appeal to Turkish voters, nationalist voters, conservative voters, etc. And you know, some of the ways that you do that in Turkey is to kind of malign the Kurds. That's always a winner. Also to kind of talk up the economy, talk about foreign conspiracies. That's always a popular one. And then talk about how awesome Turkey is. Nationalists always love that. It's true. Doesn't matter what country you're in. Nationalists love a little self-gratification.
I don't know if it's even just nationalists. It's kind of playing the buzzword game of debate, right? You look at the presidential debates in the U.S. and it's like, how many times did this person say America in the last minute? Because I love the way he says America. Gets me all inspired.
Well, that's true. You know, there are certain buttons you can push. But if you're looking to push the particular button for nationalism, that's definitely your go-to. And that's more the target, it's a specific target here in Turkey for Erdogan in the upcoming election. And so when he says that he's going to make Turkey a global power, good luck. I suspect that's more the crux of it. That's more the reason behind it. And so I don't really think he's like going to go out of his way to plan additional military actions against the Kurds or do whatever it is that would make Turkey a major global power or what have you. I think it's just electioneering, basically. Election rhetoric. There might be operations against the Kurds planned, but I don't think it's anything they wouldn't have done anyway. You know, national security planning is kind of its own entity over there. I've heard that Canadians/French Canadians had a big role in World War II. Apparently they were pretty badass doing dirty jobs. Is that true? What was their role specifically? I don't know about dirty jobs. I hadn't heard that before. But then maybe I don't know. If someone does, please post in chat. To kind of finish the disclaimer Neuro started, if I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So if I say something dumb, wrong, biased, or what have you, please do contribute in chat and point it out. Participation is encouraged in that vein. I haven't heard about Canadians doing dirty jobs in the war, but certainly they were involved in some hard fighting. I'm not as sure about French Canadians, though, because I don't think Canada had a draft during the war, but I don't think French Canadians were required to participate in the draft, if I'm remembering correctly. Somebody from Canada can correct me on that if I'm wrong. But I think the Canadian government gave French Canadians a bye, basically, because they thought it was too controversial to kind of force them to fight for Britain. Again, if I'm wrong on that, please correct me. As far as Canada's contribution, the first thing that comes to mind is the Dieppe raid, which was kind of a practice raid for D-Day. You know, I think it was in 1943 or so. And British and American planners were trying to figure out, you know, how the hell do you invade a continent? It's a tough proposition. You know, people kind of forget how hard that was at the time. You know, just logistically and in terms of, you know, deployments and troops, and just the whole thing was a nightmare. So how do you even begin to plan for something like that? So there was a raid planned at a French, I think it was French port called Dieppe. And the idea was to kind of test some of the concepts that they were working with to see how well they worked in a prospective amphibious invasion. And it was pretty much a giant clusterfuck. Just about everybody died. It was a big mess. But, you know, the upside was that they learned a lot about amphibious landings, including about what not to do. So it was a good test run, basically. And the Canadians were pretty much almost solely responsible for it. It was a Canadian operation, largely. I think there were some Free French involved, some special forces here and there, but mostly it was Canadian. and you know, they really ate shit on that one. So that they do get some credit for that. They took a beach on.
Shit? Did they actually eat shit? What?
Well, somebody had to bite the bullet, right? If you're going to float an experiment, you know, whatever kind, if you're testing an experimental airplane, testing experimental strategy, doing an experimental raid to test out amphibious invasion techniques, odds are something's going to go wrong. Mm-hmm. And if you know something's going to go wrong beforehand, you can expect to take some casualties. You can expect, you know, basically it's going to be ugly. Mm-hmm. And the Canadians were the ones who paid that price. So as far as who paid the price to kind of learn how to do an amphibious invasion, you can kind of credit the Canadians for paying that price on the part of the Allies, at least in part.
Okay, now I understand.
Yeah, so that's to their credit. And then they took a beach on D-Day. I think it was Juno, but I don't quite remember exactly which it was. The Americans took 2, the British took 2, and then Canada, I believe, had 1. So they did that successfully, so that was to their credit. I don't think it was as ugly as Omaha Beach, though. You know, everybody else and their mother got their tanks onto the beaches just fine, but there was a lot of problems for the Americans trying to get their tanks onto Omaha Beach, and so a lot of the armor didn't make it, and so it was basically infantry versus entrenched fortifications, with the result that it was a bloodbath, which is why Omaha Beach is sort of the one that always gets portrayed in movies. For those who don't know, if you've seen Saving Private Ryan, or probably just about any other movie about D-Day, it was probably really violent. You could see people taking casualties everywhere, etc. Probably didn't see a lot of armored vehicles. That's not because there weren't any. It's because there weren't any on Omaha Beach. Generally, all of the portrayals in movies are specifically Omaha Beach. Things went a lot more smoothly in the other beaches. If you made a movie about those, it wouldn't really be quite as dramatic. Still very hard fighting, mind you, but Omaha Beach was kind of another level because a lot of the tanks and the I'm not even sure what you would call them. They had these devices to try to float the tanks onto the beach from the landing ships, and a lot of them failed. So just a good chunk of the armor just didn't make it. And so just they got hammered really bad as a result of that. But most beaches were not like that. So your image of D-Day, if you don't know that, is probably a bit skewed by Hollywood on that count. But Canada had one of the smoother beaches. They did things pretty much to the book and pushed on without too much incident. Again, if I'm wrong, please correct me. This is what I'm remembering. It's been a while since I've studied D-Day, suffice to say. Let me see. After that, I don't think Canada was too involved in the fighting for Calais. There was this is something else that Americans might not know. Americans are maybe more familiar with what happened to the American forces after D-Day. After D-Day, the American forces, well, of course, there was the famous, like, month-long battle in the hedgerows, the Battle of the Hedgerows, which was very ugly. Maybe I should explain that, too. I mean, a couple layers deep. Hedgerows are like these big bushes, I guess. I'm not sure what the technical name would be, but basically foliage. And they were all over the place in northern France. They were lining the roads, and it was mostly rural, too, so it's not like it was an urban area. And they were such that it was very easy to stage an ambush. And so the Allied forces, I think all of them, both British and American, kind of got stuck fighting through these hedgerows for a while because they just couldn't go 10 feet without getting ambushed. I think they just ended up bombing the hell out of the hedgerows after a while. But eventually, after they got through the hedgerows, there was a major breakout by General Patton, and he took his armored forces and blitzed through the center of France. Almost got cut off at Falaise, I think it was, but they managed to hold. That was actually an interesting battle too, the Battle of Falaise. But they were able to deflect that German thrust. The armor was able to go on unimpeded, and they were eventually able to encircle a good chunk of what was left of the German army in France at the time. But at the same time that was happening, the British were actually fighting a pitched battle in a city called Calais that was not too far from the landing beach. And it wasn't by accident. You know, there was a desire to push for Calais, not only because it was a big city, but also because they wanted to distract the Germans. The major thrust was always intended to be the American thrust, but there was a desire to try to bog the Germans down in fighting for Calais, or at least around the British sector, so that German forces would not be directed at the American side while they were building up for the big push. So the British fought an ugly, tough urban battle for Calais, tying down a good chunk of the German army. And as I recall, the German command believed that the Calais thrust was the principal Allied thrust. They thought that they were meeting and checking the Allied invasion. They were pretty surprised when Patton broke out. They hadn't really been quite expecting that. Again, if I'm remembering this correctly. So I don't think the Canadians were involved in the Battle of Calais. I think that they were responsible more for guarding the flank of the British fighting in Calais. I could be wrong on that, but I think that's what it was. Later on, though, they did participate in very heavy fighting. And I think this might be the dirty work that this person is referring to in their question. There was very heavy fighting in the Low Countries, in places like the Netherlands, and I think to a lesser degree Belgium, if not also kind of the northwestern part of Germany. Canadians and some British forces fought through there, and it was very difficult fighting because of the terrain. There was a lot of bottlenecks because of all the canal. You know, it's called the Low Countries for a reason, right? It's, you know, a lot of it is flooded, a lot of it is underwater. There's a lot of canals everywhere. You know, it's very easy to defend that territory, basically, because of the nature of the terrain. And so they had to fight through some very difficult German defenses in order to try to push through all that. And that was largely Canadian, if I remember correctly. So that's also to their credit. That had originally been kind of the Allied plan. Well, there was a big debate about that, so maybe I shouldn't say that. There was a big debate about how to invade Germany. One side of the debate said, let's just use a huge thrust of American forces right into the center of Germany. Just push right over the Rhine and into the heart of Germany. And another line of debate, and this was actually the British preference, was to take mostly British and Canadian forces in the north, kind of in the Low Countries in that area, and have a big thrust into Hamburg, cross the Rhine further north, close to the Atlantic, and then push south down the Rhine from the east, on the eastern side, and to just roll up German defenses that way. So there was a big debate about that, and then Eisenhower had a very political solution. He basically split the difference. He gave fuel and resources for some of those proposed operations, but not enough to really carry them out in full. So Patton got enough to blitz some of the way to the Rhine, but he ran out of gas on the way. So he wasn't able to push all the way. Montgomery was given enough resources to push some of the way to the Rhine himself, but again, got bogged down. I think some of that, I don't quite remember if Operation Market Garden was a part of that. That might have been after. I'm not quite sure on the timing. But part of the Operation Market Garden, the idea behind it was to seize, I think, a series of bridges. I think it was 3 bridges. And, you know, normally bridges are difficult to take because they're pretty well defended generally. So the idea was, let's send paratroopers ahead of the invading force and try to take these bridges before the Germans can kind of fortify them. And then our armor can just blitz through these bridges and cross all these rivers that would otherwise be very difficult to take. Just kind of do it all at once and take a lot of ground, surprise the Germans. You know, if you remember Operation Market Garden, then you know it was a giant clusterfuck. You know, just everybody got killed. It was a big mess. Basically, the British paratroopers ended up having to fight a surprise panzer division that they hadn't known was there. And paratroopers are light infantry. They're not really well equipped to fight panzers. And so they got mangled pretty badly as a result. Again, I'm not sure if that happened during that big push or if it was after, a compromise agreement that was reached after. It might have been after, but, you know, regardless, the decision was split the difference, kind of let them both do something, and as a result, they weren't really either able to accomplish a whole lot, not as much as they'd wanted to. Not sure. Oh, can't write. So Canadians, for their part, were part of that northern push, and yeah, there was a lot of hard fighting up there, long story short. That's about all I remember of Canada and their contribution. Certainly they had some tough fighting and were responsible for that, but beyond that, I'm not sure what else they would refer to. I don't know that I would call that dirty, per se, just very difficult. Let's see. Trump supporters seem to want to point to the South Korea-North Korea peace deal as a win for him. Others say that the reason South Korea-North Korea came to any deal at all is because Trump abandoned South Korea, forcing them into an inferior position. What's your take? It is to his credit, but I don't think it's because he abandoned South Korea. You know, the Trump administration took a very hard line on North Korea, and in conjunction with that, put a lot of pressure on China to try to clamp down on North Korea. by trying to encourage them to put more sanctions on them and adhere to sanctions that were already in place. So the combined pressure on North Korea and China, I think, played a big role in getting sort of the negotiations to where they are now. But I don't think they ever really abandoned South Korea. You know, I don't think there was ever really much of a credible threat on the part of the Trump administration to just walk away from the peninsula. It's true that the South Korean government was trying to take a friendlier approach to North Korea, but you know, they scuppered that when it became apparent the North Koreans were going to continue their nuclear program. I don't know that that really had much to do with the Trump administration per se. More to do, I would think, with North Korean actions. And I think the South Korean government and the US government have been pretty good about coordinating on North Korea thus far. So I wouldn't characterize it as an abandonment. But yeah, I definitely would say it's, well, it could be a win for it. It depends on how things go. But thus far, it's a win for the administration. Their strategy on the issue seems to be working. We'll see if it pans out in the long run, but so far, so good. Is there any consistent strategy to U.S. intervention in the Middle East? Or does each administration just make it up as they go along, incoherent with respect to the previous administration? How strong is the steadying influence of long-standing institutions like the military and other bureaucracies in making these decisions? An interesting question. Yeah, it's not either or. It's kind of both. I mean, every administration wants to put their mark on foreign policy. Everybody kind of has their own preferences, their own little things that they want to do differently. But there's a limit to just how much they can really break from the past. And I think Neuro kind of brought this up last week, that you know, as much as you might not like the status quo with regard to any given foreign policy issue, you can't really approach it as though it's new. It's always a standing issue. Well, almost always a long-standing issue, or no, standing issue. Let's say that. And you do have to kind of take into account what's been happening before you got there into your decision making. So you can't really break too much. You are restrained somewhat by previous administrations' actions and preferences and strategies. Is there any consistent strategy to U.S. intervention in the Middle East? The consistency kind of lay in the motivation, because the motivation is almost always a combination of protecting regional allies and their interests and enforcing some kind of norm. In the case of Iraq, it was nominally the weapons of mass destruction. You know, they were nominally, well, the United States government asserted at that time that the Iraqi government was breaking a resolution, a UN resolution, with regard to the development of weapons of mass destruction and restrictions on their program. You know, I don't know how many people remember it, but the Hussein government went out of its way to kind of be cagey about its weapons program. And you know, I feel it happening right now. I know somebody is bugging out and saying that I'm saying the war was about weapons of mass destruction. I'm not saying that. I'm not going to get into why the United States invaded Iraq, unless somebody wants to, because it's a fun conversation. But I'm not making that argument here. I'm just saying that the Hussein government in Iraq went out of its way to be cagey about its weapons program so that it could use it as leverage. That kind of reflects the North Korean strategy of trying to look and sound as crazy as possible, just to be more threatening than it actually is, so that it can have more leverage in its relations. Saddam Hussein did something different, where he was purposely cagey about whether or not there was still a weapons program, so that he could have more leverage. The gamble being that the United States would not kind of assume that he did and then invade on that pretext. Turned out to be a pretty bad gamble, suffice to say.
We need
Didn't pan out for him.
Less weapons of mass destruction, more weapons of mass discretion.
That's pretty good. I like that.
You accidentally said that, and I was like, that's actually really cool.
Yeah, that's good. I like that. I'll have to remember that. But yeah, the consistency of U.S. strategy in the region is always enforcing some kind of notion of regional security, be that in the form of enforcing ostensible international norms with regard to weapons of mass destruction, as was the case with Iraq. Something similar was done with Libya in the 80s. Also with Syria with regard to its chemical weapons program. And then there's also protecting regional allies. And, you know, how do you protect a regional ally, especially when its interests are a little bit vague? Like if it's being invaded by a foreign country, that's pretty clear cut. Iraq invading Kuwait was a pretty clear cut example. So no shock that the United States came and threw the Iraqis out of Kuwait. But when it gets to something like subversion or instability, things like that, where do you draw the line? You know, to what degree is Iran trying to destabilize the region? To what degree is Iran trying to undermine the Saudi government? And to the extent that it is doing those things, to what extent does the United States government have an obligation to do something about it? And if it does have an obligation to do something about it, what? What does it do? What would be the appropriate response? That's a lot of questions to ask in order to define just what America should be doing in the Middle East, and everybody answers each of those questions differently. You know, that's a big reason why policy in the Middle East is so confusing, because there are so many different questions as far as to how you do certain things that the United States wants to do in the region. And different people have different preferences, and so invariably different people are pissed off or pleased by whatever given policy any given government goes with. You know, it's just very difficult to do. And because every new administration brings with it new people who have different perspectives and preferences, every administration comes in with a very different set of definitions for what constitutes answers to these different questions. And as a result, things tend to play out a little differently. But the overarching consistency is, again, this notion of protecting the national security of regional allies and international norms. Those are kind of the two most consistent aspects. And let's see, the other part of the question was, how strong is the steadying influence of long-standing institutions like the military and other bureaucracies in making these decisions? They're very important factors, but they're not the only factors. You know, you saw that in the Obama administration. The military, of course, is kind of your go-to as far as national security issues, national security advice. You know, if you want to know what somebody's planning or if there's any plots you want to know about, you go to your national security apparatus, your intelligence agencies, what have you, and they tell you what they know. But the final decision is ultimately a civilian decision. You know, they can inform you, they can give you information. Maybe if they want to be a little bit manipulative, they can kind of skew how they present the decisions to you, or maybe not present certain possibilities to you that they don't want you to pick so that you don't know about them. But ultimately, it is kind of your call as the president, you know, as a civilian leader. And there's a lot of other voices competing with the military and national security apparatus as far as policy. And in the Obama administration, it was those voices that kind of won out over the national security apparatus. There was a lot of people who were very skeptical about intervention, who did not want the United States to intervene in Syria or to have a significant role in Iraq or Afghanistan. And those people had a big debate with the national security apparatus people and ultimately won out, and the Obama administration ended up taking a very kind of laissez-faire approach to America's involvement in these different regions. It was very much predicated mostly on the assumption that it would be better if the United States pulled out and tried to balance things from afar. Offshore balancing, I think the strategy is nominally called. They were never particularly explicit about that or particularly coherent about that. That's one of the valid criticisms of the Obama administration's foreign policy. It was a bit reactionary. But certainly that's an example of how institutions like the military are important to the decision-making process, but can be trumped, so to speak. They can be overridden by other factors. Important factors, but not the only factors. Let's see. Doesn't the steel and aluminum industry need a ton of electricity? I don't know much about the industry or the US's industry specifically, but if my electricity assumption is true, then doesn't the US have a fundamental and stark disadvantage compared to countries like Norway or Iceland? Presumably Norway and Iceland are able to produce cheaper electricity. I guess the implicit assumption here is, I don't know a lot about electricity production in Norway and Iceland, so I don't really know how much cheaper it would be there. Yeah, however expensive it is, it's still viable, I would think. you know, there's plenty of water. Well, electricity is relatively cheap in the United States, as far as I know. If I'm wrong, please correct me on that. So I wouldn't think it would be, if it is a disadvantage, I wouldn't think it would be a big disadvantage. Let's see, I don't, what am I? Yeah, I wouldn't think it would be a huge disadvantage if those industries did consume a lot of electricity. Because the United States is a huge producer of energy, including electricity. So I would think that even if we can't produce it as efficiently in the United States, we can still produce enough of it that it's relatively cheap. Whereas in a place like Norway or Iceland, I know Iceland has geothermic energy and a lot of other natural resources like that they can tap. They might be able to produce it more efficiently, but they can't really produce it to the same scale. And also they don't really have access to markets. You know, I don't think Iceland, certainly, maybe also Norway, is really well connected to a larger network of electric power that they can kind of use to share their excess electricity production. So even if they can produce more, they can't necessarily produce it more efficiently. Also, I don't think Norway or Iceland have big steel or aluminum industries or deposits that they could use to make a steel or aluminum industry. I note here that you say like Norway or Iceland, so you're really just using Norway or Iceland as an example. So hypothetically, if there were a country that had a steel or aluminum industry, would not their, well, they have a steel and aluminum industry and they have efficient power generation, would they not have an advantage? Hypothetically, yes. But I don't think electricity is like a really huge determinant of the cost of production for the industry. There's probably other factors that are more important. Specifically iron ore, I would imagine. I think you make steel from iron ore, right? You're supposed to mix it with something? I don't know. I'm talking out of my ass on that. I don't know my metallurgy. I apologize. I should brush up on it. But I would imagine inputs are probably the more important determinant of final cost. Electricity is, you know, important. It's relevant, but I don't think the American disadvantage would be great enough to kind of discount it, to discount the steel industry. The problem the U.S. steel industry has is not so much electricity. It's more just inefficiency and lack of competitiveness overall. Labor is relatively expensive in the United States. That partly has to do with unions, partly to do with regulations, partly to do with transportation, you know, regulations. There's a whole host of things that kind of come together there. And that altogether is more important. There's also, you know, technological change, free trade that also factors in. So electricity is a consideration, but it's not the consideration. Got a little different, kind of a meandering answer. I apologize if that's not particularly coherent.
We're good at that here.
Oh yeah. Would you muse on the developing Chinese social credit system and the potential of other governments implementing similar policies? So short answer here, I haven't heard anything new about it. So I don't really have anything that I can update you with. For those who are not really familiar with what this is, China is proposing, the Chinese government, I should say, is proposing a credit system in which instead of measuring your financial credit, you know, your financial reliability, you're instead judged and scored based on certain social factors. Not, you know, partly including whether or not you pay back debt, but also, you know, how much, if you've been in trouble at work, if you've ever been laid off, or if you've ever been in trouble with the law, if you've ever been a criminal, if other people rate you badly because you did something shitty to them. Presumably there's also going to be a political factor, which is kind of what concerns people. If you are not sufficiently pro-communist in China, hypothetically, they could take some points off of your score. So you might wonder, well, so what if they take some points off of your social credit score? Who's going to care? Well, the government is trying to push this as a factor that should be considered when you hire or fire people, or when you give out a loan, or what have you. It's the government wants this to kind of be relevant to the decision-making process, to decision-making processes in the economy. So it may be that if you're a viable candidate for a job, but maybe you said something that the party doesn't like at some point, you may find that you're not able to get a job in your chosen field because you had some points knocked off of your quote-unquote social credit score on account of those statements. And, you know, there's a lot of issues like that that could happen. You know, what if somebody games the system? What if somebody, what's the word I want, extorts you? What if somebody in position to change your score extorts you for money or something in exchange for not changing your score? I mean, there's a lot of potential problems there with that, especially considering that it's probably going to be controlled by an authoritarian one-party state. So that's that's roughly what the social credit score idea is. I haven't heard any updates on the Chinese government doing anything new with it, and I haven't heard of any other country trying to adopt a similar system. You know, if anybody else has heard different, you know, please contribute in chat and let me know. But as far as I know, there's been no movement on that issue, on that particular issue.
It seems a little bit invasive, I think, for most people as a concept.
Yeah, certainly for Americans.
We would prefer to just be under surveillance and not know about it.
Unfortunately so.
Ignorance is bliss.
Oh, isn't it though? Yeah, Kukio used to go on about that. He had a real hair up his ass about that.
Yep.
Yeah, I think anybody who was kind of around for the Bush administration during the early war on terror kind of remembers what an issue privacy was. Like, there was a real debate about, you know, how much privacy should we trade for security and that whole thing. And that kind of went away after a while. But nothing was ever really changed. Like, all of those invasive measures, invasive policies, a lot of those changes were never really challenged. And are kind of still in place, even though that debate was never really conclusively finished. Like, nobody ever really said, okay, we're going to trade these privacies for more security, or no, let's kind of draw back. People just kind of dropped it and moved on. You know, that whole war on terror debate about how do you deal with terrorism was never really adequately addressed or finished. People just kind of got tired of it. And then the 2008 financial crisis happened, and then the politics of the country as a whole basically just moved past it, which is unfortunate. Because there's definitely a lot of loose ends from the early war on terror that need to be cleaned up. I mean, I think they did end up replacing the Patriot Act with something, but I think that something else is not entirely palatable for everybody either. Obviously, that's a matter of subjective opinion. Different people will have different preferences there. But speaking as somebody who was a bit critical, certainly there was never really a satisfactory debate about that, I think. But even beyond that, there's the whole issue of, you know, drone strikes, assassinations. Guantanamo Bay is kind of a running issue. It's a legal black hole. I don't know how many people realize that. There is no real legal definition or legal realm in which Guantanamo Bay kind of falls under. So it's just sort of this place where the government can kind of do what it wants, which is problematic because that's not generally something that you want your government to kind of be able to do, to kind of have at its disposal. You know, either pull out of Guantanamo Bay or pass some legislation that kind of legalizes it, that gives it a formal legal framework. Now, that's editorializing, though. Obviously, up to individual politics and opinion as to what you want to do with Guantanamo Bay. But that is a kind of loose thread, so to speak, from the war on terror. There was a big debate about it, and then it just kind of went away, and people stopped talking about it. And then there was, what do you do with terrorists? That's kind of another loose end. There was some opinion that you can kind of treat them like pirates, that you can kind of arrest them under certain provisions of international law. There was a push under the early Bush administration to treat them like unlawful combatants. You know, if you're fighting another country and fighting their soldiers, those enemy soldiers are lawful combatants.
Combatants?
Unlawful combatants. Sorry, what?
Combatants?
Combatant, thank you. Combatant.
So
keep me straight.
Yeah, well, you read more than you, I think, say the words aloud. So sometimes it's just how you sound it out, right? Which is viable. That's what you're supposed to do.
No, I'm terrible at pronunciation. I don't hardly talk to anybody, so my pronunciations tend to be pretty off, even when I'm speaking English, nominally my first language. You'd think I'd be better at it by now.
Well, we welcome your practice here in this space.
Oh, thank you. Kukio and I used to go back and forth on that. We used to correct each other's pronunciations. I still remember when I was getting chic wrong. I was pronouncing it chick.
Ah.
That was an interesting conversation.
Well,
Kind of makes me wonder how many people I weirded out over the course of my life saying things were chick.
We have an example, chic is the way.
Mm-hmm.
We have an example in the StarCraft community. Before we had all these streams and major tournaments and stuff, people would just tell their friends this is the name of the unit. Like, Mutalisk was a unit that wasn't pronounced very accurately most of the time. And we have a beloved caster in the scene, Artosis. He said zealots for a long time instead of zealots, which in the English language it is pronounced zealot. Maybe there are some different accents you could put on that, but it's not zealot for sure. But he still kind of has his own way of saying that because it was just him with his friends learning the game and talking about the game and stuff. He's sounding it out. There's no harm in that.
Yeah. So with the unlawful combatants,
Yeah.
unlawful combatants, that's another kind of loose end because that was never really clarified either. What do you do with a international terrorist organization that is trying to commit unlawful acts on your territory or against your citizens overseas? Do you just arbitrarily kill them? Do you arrest them? Can you arrest them? If you do arrest them, what do you charge them with? Can you charge them with anything? All of that is still kind of up in the air a little bit. So these are kind of all examples of ambiguities left over from the War on Terror. And how did I even get onto that?
Guantanamo Bay?
Yeah. Talking about loose ends from the War on Privacy. That's what it was. Privacy is an example of one of those loose ends. And we were talking about privacy because we were talking about the Chinese social credit law. And you were saying that, yes, we're okay with being surveyed so long as we don't know about it, right? That's what it was. Yeah, Americans in general don't know. I don't think most Americans know the degree to which there is surveillance and are generally okay with that so long as it's not too much of an issue. So something like the Facebook issue kind of shows where the interest really lies. The problem is not that the government is engaging in surveillance. The problem is when somebody does something with that surveillance that you don't like or that is offensive to your particular politics. So in other words, privacy in the United States as a political issue is very parochial. How people judge it really depends on their very personal preferences and how it impacts them personally, specifically. Yeah, Kukio used to be crazy about that. You know, nobody cares about this. It's a huge issue. It's not constitutional, etc., etc. You'd go on about it. You would probably be a bit. You would probably find the whole Facebook thing hilarious.
Yeah.
You know, you don't care about the War on Terror privacy debate, but this bullshit Facebook debate. Oh yeah, that's a huge thing. Okay.
Well, Facebook is a word that a lot of people know. I know about Facebook. I have a Facebook thing. They did what to my Facebook? Oh God. I didn't say yes to this. Well, not that I'm aware of.
I get the impression most of those people wouldn't really care if Donald Trump had not won the election in 2016. I suspect if Clinton had won, it would have been a non-issue.
I don't know. The whole security and privacy thing, you have to go to pretty great lengths to have anything that is either secure or private. With a lot of technology that a lot of people aren't aware of how it works or why it's important.
That's true. That's a good point. There is a question of literacy there.
Yeah, the people who know about security are like, oh God, but most people are like, what? What is that?
We'll get there eventually.
We're still too busy plugging our USB in the wrong way. Why doesn't this ever work the first time?
Well, some people are better at it than others. I guess that does kind of beg the question if civilization has become so complex that it's kind of beyond the ability of at least people under a certain age or without a certain amount of experience to really be able to fully comprehend it and fully judge it. And it's just getting more complicated the more technological development there is. I'll leave that as an open question for chat. I don't really have a lot to add to that. Let's see, what was the next one? The flotation device the tanks were fitted with in World War II were called duplex drive tanks. Oh, okay, thank you. And because of the acronym and function, people called them Donald Duck tanks.
Wow.
Oh, I didn't know that they had the nickname. Yeah, there was a... They used those, and then they had some other gadgets. There was a lot of weird stuff they designed specifically for D-Day. I think the British called them funnies, or somebody's funnies, something to that effect. And they were just these weird little innovative inventions that were meant to try to help out. You know, Mulberry Harbors are an example. You know, if you're going to have an invasion of a continent, you need a place to unload supplies for your army, and that generally means you need a port. This port has the infrastructure you need to quickly and efficiently unload supplies from ships and get them to the front line. And if you're going to invade a continent, especially one where you know the opponent is not going to let you easily have access to ports, they're going to fight pretty hard for them and they're going to sabotage them, which is exactly what the Germans did. If you know you're not going to have access to ports for a while, what are you going to do? Because your army is going to need those supplies in the early going of the invasion. Well, the solution that the British and Americans came up with was to create an artificial harbor, an artificial floating harbor, which was just literally a big floating harbor that they tugged out into the Atlantic Ocean, into the English Channel, and then once the invasion had taken the beaches, they moved them up close to the beach, and then they used them to unload supplies from cargo ships. And for a good while after D-Day, that was the principal source of supplies for the invading armies. I think if I recall correctly, the British one was made better than the American one. They were a little more thorough. And the reason I say that is because there was a storm before D-Day and it kind of wrecked the American one, but the British one was able to kind of hold out. And so that was the one they ended up using in the early going. It took a while to repair the American Mulberry Harbor. But yeah, there was a lot of weird innovative stuff like that. You know, if you ever watch a documentary about D-Day or specifically about interesting D-Day inventions, you know, they'll generally kind of cover that. Do you have any personal theories explaining the broadest arcs of history? Not really. I have to study a lot more history to kind of be confident enough to push a theory. There's a lot of it, and it tends to wax and wane. That's about it's about the extent of my grand theory of history. I would argue, it's not a theory, but an argument, I would argue that history is not linear. I know there's an argument that, what was it? The arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. That's what the quote was. I think in general that's true. But I think history overall is not particularly linear. It tends to change a lot. There's times when there's periods of time when there's a lot of progress and forward thinking and economic development, and then there's just periods that are real garbage. They just get really bad. And I don't think there's any reason to think we've really escaped that. There is a tendency towards utopian thinking, and sort of the past 100, 200 years, basically since the Industrial Revolution has happened, there's been so much progress that people tend to think, oh, well, we've got this by the ass, we know how to do things now. Everything is just going to be a straight shot to utopia. Not really. It's going to go wrong at some point again. You know, people, you know, if you look at the Victorian era in the late 1800s, those people thought that they were at the apex of history. They really thought that they had figured shit out. Little did they know. World War I, World War II, the Cold War, communism. I mean, it was a real shit show in Europe for a while in the 20th century. But you wouldn't have known it if you were sitting around in the year 1900 in London, right? Things were going really well at that time. So history can take a dramatic turn, and you won't see it coming. It'll just kind of happen, and everybody will be left scratching their heads trying to figure out what the fuck happened. And historians will look back and say, oh yeah, actually they should have seen that coming. Yeah, you can totally see the pattern. But it's hard to see what's going on when you're in the middle of the storm, right? When history is happening around you, you can't really see the pattern emerging that readily. If you could, that would solve a lot of problems, but generally you can't. Generally you need more information in order to really recognize a pattern. And when it comes to history and, you know, the movement of politics and economies and that kind of thing, generally by the time you have enough information to kind of see it, it's already played out and there's not a lot you can do about it.
Hindsight's pretty good.
Yeah, that's putting it mildly. So that statement is about as close as I would come to a grand theory of history. And that's not much, believe me. There's a lot more to it than that.
So it's a little bit tuned back from everything that can go wrong will go wrong. It's more like something's going to go wrong that you don't expect. So be prepared.
Yeah. Humans are not omnipotent creatures.
Yes.
You know, we don't understand the world, the economy, human behavior, the brain even. We don't understand any of that well enough to really make a confident prediction about the future. And, well, even to really understand any of that in any great depth. So without doing that, you can't really be too confident about the future. And it does serve one to be somewhat wary and to hedge one's bets as far as what happens in the future. You know, if you were living in the Soviet Union in the Cold War in the 1970s, you know, things were starting to stagnate, but would you have predicted that 15 years later, one of the most powerful countries in the world would not exist? Probably not. That probably would have sounded like some science fiction type shit, right? That's some far-fetched stuff. That's like saying the United States won't exist 20 years from now. Like, would anybody believe you? Probably not. It would just be too much of a stretch. But you never know. Things change. 20 years is a long time. You'd be surprised just how dramatically the world can change in 20 years. I mean, shit, just look at how much the world has changed in the past 5 years. Think about where the world was and how you thought of the world 5 years ago compared to now. All of that is just based on perception. A lot of that is just based on changes in how we perceive the world. Think about how dramatically the world would change and how dramatically the way you think about it would change if there were a lot more structural changes to the economies and societies and politics of the world over the next 20 years. Even more dramatic than what we've seen over the past 5. You know, it would be significant, almost dramatic change to that extent. Anyway, I'm belaboring the point. You get it. It's a bad habit. Sometimes I do that. Is the U.S. in need of reforms to copyright and patent law? These days it seems like it does little to quote-unquote promote the progress of science and useful arts, end quote, and is instead wielded to destroy competition in established industries, to say nothing of the patent troll phenomenon. If you don't know what the patent troll phenomenon is, that's when basically people go out and buy patents just so that they can litigate with them. Basically, they go out and they find something that is legitimately of that patent, or maybe something that is close enough that you could accuse it of being a copy of your patented material, and then you take them to court and reach a settlement in which they give you money to fuck off. That's patent trolling. There's no substantive issue at play. Like, you're not a producer who produces something and then somebody steals your design. You're just a nobody who doesn't produce anything, and then you just use the legal system to extract value from people who do produce things. That's sort of the essence of patent trolling. That's a problem. That's not good for innovation or the economy or what have you. It doesn't really contribute anything. So in that sense, yes, you could argue that the U.S. is in need of copyright and patent reform. But here's the problem with patents. Invariably, where you draw the line as far as what constitutes copyright infringement rather, where you draw that copyright infringement line is always going to be arbitrary and hazy. It's always going to require a judgment call. I mean, it's just, given how similar a lot of new technology is to each other, or given designs are to each other, or given software is to each other, it's just a lot of that new technology just lends itself, is just innately difficult to parse in terms of parsing whether or not it's a copy of another design. So invariably, a certain amount of enforcement of copyright law is going to be somewhat arbitrary. And there's no quick and easy solution to that. You know, basically it's one of those things where no matter what decision you make, somebody's going to be pissed off. You know, there's always going to be a cost. You can tighten up the patent law to make it harder to engage in patent trolling, to make it harder to infringe on somebody else's patents. Well, maybe not that, but cracking down on patent trolling specifically would require, well, actually the opposite. It would require loosening patent laws. So if you want less patent trolling, you would almost invariably have to loosen patent laws, and that would mean less protections for designs, copyrights, etc. So that comes with an obvious cost. It's easier to copy designs. It's harder to make money off of your design and get a return off of the research you did in order to get that design, etc. In contrast, you can tighten up patent laws such that creators and designers, inventors have more protections, but then that makes the process more political, right? You have to get into the weeds even more about whether this, that, or the other design is infringing. So there's going to be more court cases, more judgments that have to be made. So wherever you move that needle, you know, wherever on that spectrum between light versus heavy patent law, you're going to have costs and benefits. And, you know, in the United States in general, we prefer tighter patent law because we want to reward and incentivize innovation. But the downside of that, as this person, you know, kind of points out, is that it's easy to abuse the system. Are there specific targeted reforms that could be made that still incentivize innovation but deal with the patent troll issue? I don't know enough about patent law and patent trolling to know the answer to that. It may be that there is, but it would probably be very difficult to implement because, again, it's just innately difficult to kind of enforce patents, especially when it comes to complicated technological innovations of one sort or another. So more likely, whatever solution there is going to be an ugly solution that ends up giving something up in order to get something else. I don't know of any airtight, objectively better system that you could really have that would just deal with all of these issues, that would still incentivize innovation, but not allow a lot of the extensive court costs of enforcing the regime. That's probably not a particularly satisfactory answer. I apologize. I'm not a patent guy. It's not quite my area. It is relevant to economics, and I have read some about it, but not enough to have like a specific solution in mind. And I'm not familiar enough with the literature that I'm sure corresponds with it to know what proposals have been made. I'm sure somebody's come up with some kind of proposal of a targeted reform that could do that, but I'm sure it would almost invariably come with some kind of downside that would come with a cost. And it would probably be in the vein of less copyright protection, less patent trolling, or more copyright protection, but more trolling of one sort or another. I don't know that you can kind of get away from that trade-off. If I'm wrong, please tell me. I would be interested to know. Again, it's an issue I would like to learn more about.
It seems like it's also kind of hairy because the nature of property has changed somewhat. Stuff from our perspective, like owning a game, is different. You used to have a physical disc, which made you feel like you possessed an item, whereas now it's more of a digital library. Like you have a signature that you have purchased certain stuff, but you don't actually have a physical copy. And it gets even weirder when you aren't even allowed to access certain stuff without an internet connection. So it's like, I think I own this, but if I can't connect to their web service, then I can't access it. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, the intangible nature of the modern digital economy, the modern services economy, that really lends itself to a complicated regime, patent regime. But like you say, it's just inherently difficult. I mean, if it's tangible, it's a little bit easier at least. I mean, even then it's complicated, but when you get into intangible things like software or an application button, I think somebody had patented some kind of notification feature in an application that they had, and they went around suing everybody and their mother because everybody had used some variant of it. Yeah, it gets real difficult. I think I guess it's not particularly relevant, but I remember in the back of my head some story from the 90s about somebody's daughter helping their daughter patent a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, just to kind of show how ridiculous the system was. I guess that's still in place too, technically. I don't remember the follow-up, and that might have been just clickbait bullshit from the 90s. It was harder to identify clickbait back then. You couldn't just Google it. Kind of had to take on faith that the source wasn't bullshitting you.
Mm.
Let's see. What do you make of the alliance between the U.S., Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Turkey? Do you expect any of these nations to expand their power by waging proxy wars like Saudi might be doing in Yemen now? Not really. They're not... You know, the Saudis and the Israelis are kind of playing defense, in a sense. You know, they're status quo powers. The Iranians are the ones who kind of want change in the region. So I don't really see them going out of their way to wage proxy wars per se, unless it relates somehow to Iran. Now, when it comes to Syria, they're actually aggressors, because Syria was just there minding its own business, trying to have a nasty civil war, and then all of a sudden all of its neighbors jumped in unasked. So in that sense, the Saudis and the Israelis, well, not so much the Israelis, at least not up till now, but in that sense, the Saudis and that kind of Western alliance is more the aggressor in Syria. But that, again, tied to Iran. You know, the Saudis would not give a shit about the Syrian civil war if not for the fact that Bashar al-Assad and his government are aligned with Iran. And I really don't know why the Assad government doesn't just offer to drop the alliance with Iran in exchange for being left alone, because that's probably what the Saudis are looking for. And it doesn't seem like a big ask. I don't really know what the Syrians actually gain from an alliance with Iran beyond the eternal enmity of the Saudi royal family and every other monarchy in the Middle East. It seems like it's more trouble than it's worth. But maybe there's some element to that alliance that I'm not that I don't know about or not factoring in. But it seems like it would be more trouble than it was worth. So I don't think the group of countries you mentioned here are going to go out of their way to expand their powers, quote unquote, by waging proxy wars like the Saudis are doing. The Saudis are not. I don't think the Saudis are waging a proxy war in Yemen to expand their power. I think they're doing it just to signal to Iran. I think we talked about this last week. I think they're just doing it to signal to Iran that they take Iran's meddling, quote unquote, in the region seriously, and they want to send a signal that whatever Iran does in the region, or maybe if whatever it doesn't do, but it's suspected of doing, will be met with a strong Saudi response. So in a sense, it's diplomacy by violence in that sense. It is not uncommon for the Middle East, unfortunately. But I don't think they're doing it so that they can expand into Yemen or annex it or something like that. I think it is just purely about diplomatic relations with Iran, and similarly so with Syria. I don't think Turkey and Saudi Arabia are in Syria to expand their power. Well, maybe Turkey might. God knows what the Turkish government was thinking when it got involved. And that's anybody's guess. Erdogan kind of lives in a world of his own at this point. But the Saudis were mostly interested in the Iranians and making sure that an Iranian ally did not make it through a civil war unscathed, if it made it through at all. Originally the intention was to overthrow the government. With the Turks, it may have just been sphere of influence. The Erdogan has a bit of an ego, suffice to say, and his foreign policy before the Syrian civil war had been very much about trying to expand Turkish influence in the Middle East economically. Not quite politically, but certainly economically, and improving ties with certain political actors, like the Kurdish autonomous region in Iraq and the two major political parties there. It may be that, it's speculation, but it may be that the Turkish government saw the Syrian civil war as a opportunity to expand Turkish influence in the region. So it may be that they didn't have any particular grudge against Bashar al-Assad or the Syrian government, just that they thought that the government was about to fall, and that if it was going to fall, why not have whatever government takes their place be a Turkish-friendly government and one that they can influence. So they may have thought it was a cheap investment at the time. They may have thought intervention was a cheap short-term investment that would have a return, and it ended up being more of a long-term investment. I don't think they realized that the conflict would drag on as long as it did. And they may not have done it in the first place if they'd known it would. Again, speculation on my part. You kind of have to reach your own conclusions as to just what the Turkish government was doing when it tried to intervene in Syria, and is still trying. But anyway, basically different. Turkey and the Saudis, and the United States for that matter, are not a homogenous bloc. I don't think they engage in activities in the region as a bloc. I don't think that what activities they do engage in, they engage in to expand their power, quote unquote. Again, I think it is more just Iran, either countering Iranian moves or countering perceived Iranian moves. You can debate whether or not they're actual Iranian moves in some cases, like in Yemen. So yeah, I guess just the frame of the question is a little bit off in that sense. I wouldn't agree with some of the implicit assumptions in the question. You know, it's not a homogenous bloc. These different countries have their own agendas, their own perceptions of their national security, of threats, etc. And I don't think expanding their power is quite their main objective. Let me see what. Yeah, I guess that about covers it. If I ever miss the crux of a question, or somebody wants elaboration, or somebody wants to have a follow-on question, please feel free. Feel free to ask in chat, and we'll be happy to get to it. Am I doing okay on time?
Yeah, we've got about 13 minutes.
Oh, okay. Running out. Let's see. Let's see. I know you specialize in current affairs, but you seem like you'd be a history buff as well. Do you have a favorite time period, region, area of history, and why does it intrigue you? 1940s, Europe, World War II. That's always been the big... I think somebody asked me a question like this last time, and the answer I have this time isn't really different. World War II is kind of the one I always come back to. It's not the one I obsess over, at least not like I used to when I was a kid. So I do other periods of history now, but World War II is kind of the one I most consistently return to. I have a budding affection for 1600s history. That's kind of a very fascinating period. I might try to do a podcast episode on that at some point. But beyond that, used to be Civil War buff when I was a kid in middle school. Used to read a lot about that. Vietnam off and on, Cold War sometimes. Colonial history, European imperial history, whatever you want to call that. I guess European history in general is pretty interesting. And, over the past 10 years, I've gotten more into Indian history. No particular era per se, just kind of in general.
They've got a
Still
pretty
learning
long
about
history.
Yeah, there's a lot to cover.
The European one.
There's a lot of meat there.
Yeah.
This is one of the fun things about it.
There are a lot of vegetarians too.
There are. There's a lot of not as many as people think, though. I think I even had an article on my Twitter feed a while back talking about how vegetarianism in India is not what people think of it as. There's actually a fair amount of meat eaters. It's kind of associated with, how do I put it? With being a good person. It's kind of the moral thing to do, the ethical thing to do. Mm-hmm. There's a kind of social prestige associated with being vegetarian. But, of course, not everybody does everything that they're supposed to do, right? I mean, there's prestige associated with being independent, not living with one's parents, and not being overweight, but some people have trouble with that. Some more than others. So, yeah, in the same way, there's a lot of people in India who don't eat meat. Some of them would recognize that they probably shouldn't, but they do anyway, that kind of thing. Yeah, things like that are important in Indian culture. That's kind of an example of prestige in Indian society is assigned more according to how moral or ethical you are, rather than how powerful you are, which is kind of one of the big differences there is with other civilizations. There is a power dynamic there, don't get me wrong, that exists. But India has kind of a special place for its gurus, its philosophers, for kind of ethical, traditional, ethical by traditional definitions behavior. In general is seen as being kind of higher, as being more prestigious. That's one of the aspects of the caste system that people don't really understand, I think. It is possible to elevate your caste. It's not actually true that you're born into a caste and then that caste has a fixed position in society. It is actually possible to elevate your caste by engaging in prestigious behavior, by being vegetarian, by observing certain rituals, by being more familiar with certain religious doctrines, depending on the religious doctrine in question, being more familiar with the literature in Indian, well, not the literature, with holy scripts, basically. I forget what the technical name for them is, but there's like a name for that. You know, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, etc., those things. So by doing those kinds of things over time, and if enough of the people in your caste, which is generally village, you know, there's actually a lot of different castes. It's not just the 5. There's actually thousands of different castes in India, and they tend to be region-specific, and sometimes even, you know, village-specific. But if enough people in your caste engage in prestigious behavior, then your caste as a whole will be seen to have been elevated. It will be more prestigious, and people won't shit on you like they probably did before. So caste is a little more fluid than, well, it's a lot more fluid than people kind of give it credit for. It's not to say that there aren't caste problems and that some people get stuck, but that's an overarching socioeconomic issue more than it is a caste-specific issue. You know, there's plenty of people in American history who were far more violent about caste and caste divisions than certain people in India now. Again, not to downplay caste violence in India, but other civilizations have equivalents to caste violence that they just don't recognize as caste violence because they don't really have explicit caste. You know, you could consider slavery as an institution in the United States as a kind of caste system. And obviously slaves and free African Americans subsequent to the end of slavery have suffered grievously on account of what amounts to a de facto caste system in the United States. And, you know, that's debatable to the extent to which that's true, but it's an example of how every society suffers from that. Caste violence is not something that's really unique to India per se. The institution itself is unique. Some of the manifestations of the violence in the institution are unique. But having people be violent against each other for various reasons is not new. And those reasons often come down to economic. I think one of the most caste violence-prone regions of India is in the north, kind of in the Hindu belt. And that's more agricultural. Generally, large landowners kind of abuse the people who work the land, who tend to be lower caste. And that's not really a caste issue, per se. That's more of a, I own the land and you need to do what I say issue. Obviously, some people don't like that. Anyway, I don't want to get too much into that, because I'm still learning about caste in India, and I could easily be wrong on some of that. So I want to research it more before being too definitive on it, before commenting on it too much. But that's where my understanding is right now, anyway. So let's see. That's kind of a tangent on the question of historical interest. So yeah, I tend to meander a lot. In rhetoric as well as in research, I tend to meander a lot, jumping from topic to topic. How do you think the ongoing housing shortage in urban areas will affect economic growth over the near term? Are there any historical comparisons to be made? I mean, raw economics would suggest that prices will go up and that production will in turn go up to meet demand until prices start to fall. That's just kind of raw economics logic. Whether or not that actually plays out like that kind of is a function of local regulations, local demand dynamics, you know, what's causing the demand, what's causing the restriction in supply, etc. So it depends on the market in question and the reasons for the shortage in the first place, and how certain structural factors are designed. Again, regulation being the preeminent one. One of the reasons that Britain has a housing shortage is because there's a lot of red tape for building a new house. There's a lot of issues as far as, you know, registering and meeting certain requirements as far as affordable housing. There's a whole thing there. I don't know all of it in detail, but I've read about it a bit over the past few years. It tends to crop up a fair amount. Let's see, so I would guess that's how it pans out, but again, it depends on the case you're talking about. Different markets, different countries, etc. will have different experiences with housing shortages. I guess it would help if I knew what country you were referring to here, because I guess you could assume the United States, but there's not all that many markets in the United States that have a housing shortage. Southern California kind of comes to mind. I would guess that would play out kind of like I described. I don't think regulations are so restrictive there that the market could not eventually alleviate that. It's going to take a while, though. It's not going to happen overnight. It'll take like 5-10 years. But on the other hand, if you're talking about Britain or maybe Australia or someplace in Europe or Rwanda, in Angola, which is one of the richest, well, one of the most expensive cities in the world, mostly because of the dynamism of its oil industry. You know, you could be referring to any of those. China is another case in point. China has very expensive property prices right now. In some cities more than others. There's variance there as well. So perhaps some elaboration would allow me to get more specific with the answer, but without that, I would just kind of go with the default economic answer. And I don't know about historical comparisons, because again, every case is kind of unique. You know, every case kind of plays out differently depending on the dynamics in play.
I heard there's some pretty cheap real estate in Vancouver. People with expensive prices in China.
Yeah, that's kind of gotten to be an issue up there.
Yeah, I think we've addressed that a couple times.
Yeah, a couple times. But yeah, that is a problem. Somebody a couple months ago was saying that Canada was having was experiencing higher housing prices, something of a housing crunch. But I hadn't really been familiar with Canada. With Vancouver, like you say, yeah, I've definitely heard that, but I hadn't really heard much about Canadian housing market in total having that kind of problem. Any thoughts on the appropriation of patents by the government and distribution to third parties? Appropriate? No, that's the first time I'd heard about that. I hadn't heard about the government appropriating patent. I have to write that down for later. Appropriating patents. I'll have to read more about that, but I'm sorry, I haven't heard about that, so I don't really have anything I can say. What are your thoughts? Kind of rushing to because I know Neuro wants to go to bed. What are your thoughts on Albert Pike's 1871 letter? I'd have to look it up because I don't remember it off the top of my head. 1871 letter. And then there was one left. How do you feel about Piketty's capital? What methods do you think might be amenable to reducing wealth inequality? If that's a desirable goal in your opinion? Yeah, Piketty is a French economist. He wrote a giant-ass book called Capital, and it was about inequality, and I have not read it, so I don't really have feelings about it per se. I don't know if I will read it either. I don't know if I have time for that anymore. But what methods do you think might be amenable to reducing wealth inequality, if that's a desirable goal? Whether or not it's a desirable goal is subjective. Some people are more comfortable with it than others. You know, wealth inequality is not inherently bad per se. A lot of the times it happens as a result of innovation and the emergence of new industries, which tend to concentrate wealth into a few producers. And then over time, there's more competition. It tends to get watered down. And then over time, it kind of gets spread out. The wealth gets spread out more from the innovation. So in general, sometimes it's kind of a temporary thing, a transient stage of development for new industries. Sometimes it's the result of rent seeking on the part of industries or corruption or something like that. In those cases, obviously, it's a bad thing. So whether or not inequality is bad, I would judge to be kind of context dependent. It would depend on the context in which the inequality is happening. And although, again, I recognize that it's subjective to a degree, it may be that some people just don't like it on general principle. Again, that comes down to personal preferences in politics. So, you know, people are entitled to think what they would on it. So I don't really have many thoughts on the book itself. I don't really care about inequality one way or the other. It's a matter of personal opinion. And then for what methods might be amenable to reducing wealth inequality, that's tough. I mean, if nothing else, you can just force it. You could just do high taxes and redistribute income. You know, but that comes with consequences, right? So you could do lesser things. You can do a lighter touch approach in which you try to siphon some tax dollars to regions experiencing economic difficulties, to try to spread more wealth that way. You could try to establish, you could do something creative like establishing wealth funds of some sort or another, that, so that you have something that you can pay for children's higher education, so that you can try to give more people more opportunity, crafty things like that. There's no shortage of people who come up with policy innovations, proposals for new policies, kind of in that vein, innovative new things that are kind of experimental and that you don't really know whether or not they'll work over the long term. So you could try something like that too. But whatever you do, there's always going to be a cost and benefit. That's kind of the crux of it. Whatever method you choose in which to address wealth inequality is going to come with some kind of cost as a trade-off. And a lot of the debate, political debate about dealing with wealth inequality kind of gets hung up on that. Because people will say this is an evil inherent, we need to do something about it, and then other people will say, well, it's a problem, we should do something about it, but I don't want to pay the cost that comes with the policy proposal you're making. And then people argue and nothing happens. Pretty standard. So there are definitely things you can do, very clear-cut things even. The question is more, what are you willing to give up? What is the cost you're willing to pay for it? And can you reach enough of a political consensus to pay that cost in order to implement your proposed policy? That's kind of the bigger overarching question there. And that was it. That's the grand finale. I've got more in my notes if anybody wants, but I imagine you want to go to bed, right?
Well, we could go for another 5 or so, if you want.
Ooh, another 5 or so. What do I have? Brand bragging, steel and aluminum tailor. Well, so here's a question for Chad. And, and maybe that's not quite the... Well, here it is. So there's this idea of universal basic income. And, you know, my opinion of that is that it probably won't be accepted in the United States, because in the United States there's a very strong social norm in place that asserts that people should earn their living, that people should work for their living. And universal basic income doesn't really jibe with that very well. It doesn't really mesh with that sort of social norm very well. Obviously, some people would like it. I'm not saying they wouldn't. I'm just saying that overall the political and social culture in the United States is not quite amenable to UBI. So there is talk right now amongst certain Democratic candidates. You know, there's midterm elections coming up, and one of the things the Democratic Party is trying to do to try to win back votes it lost to Trump in the 2016 election is floating this idea of a job guarantee. So the idea is that you will be given a job, you are guaranteed a job, one way or the other. And so I was thinking, could that be the US equivalent of universal basic income? In which basically you're giving people money in the same way you would give it with UBI, but as part of the deal, they have to do some token work. You know, it's not really clear to me how a job guarantee would work. It seems like you're going to end up having to just force people to do bullshit work that doesn't need to be done just so that you can carry out the job guarantee, but that's a whole issue in and of itself. It's a whole discussion in and of itself. Hypothetically, if you did that, you would have this symbolic work, quote-unquote, being done in exchange for your UBI payment. And that could satisfy this pre-existing social norm in the United States to make it more palatable, such that it could be feasible. So my question to Chad is that accurate? Could that be the future? Could that be the way that UBI is enacted in the United States? Would that be more acceptable here? Or does that still not quite mesh enough? Is that still not quite an acceptable solution for all of the people who really want to work for, basically think people should work for their living, and that UBI does not satisfy that? So food for thought, you don't have to answer it right now. That's just something I wanted to throw out there and to kind of see what people thought about it. Or at least to get people to think about it. Maybe they can come back next week and tell me how full of shit I am on it, one way or the other. Feedback is welcomed.
Please help us.
Oh, let's see. And then there was, yeah, we already talked about Obrador in Mexico and those elections. Talked a little bit about caste. Talked about that. I guess I don't really have anything I could go into in just 5 minutes.
Everything's too deep.
Yeah, I've got some older stuff with more depth, but I'd have to read it again to kind of remember it, get my memory jogging. Egypt had elections. Malaysia, there's actually that's something. There's a number of elections coming up. I posted that on Twitter today. Already talked about the Mexican elections. Malaysia has elections coming up. There was a article today talking about how there's a lack of enthusiasm amongst the youth voters in Malaysia because the political system and political culture in Malaysia are such that discourage basically participation. Like nobody's in any real doubt as to what the outcome of the election is going to be. That's not to say Malaysia is an authoritarian country. It's more like autocratic. You know, it's unfair competition. They have democracy, they have elections, but they're not really completely free and fair. And to be fair, the ruling coalition does have a fair amount of legitimacy and support, but they don't allow real competition, and if there were, they might not have nearly as much power as they do. So that's kind of an example of illiberal democracy at work. It's quite possible to have the trappings of a democratic institution, a democratic system of governance, but in practice you may kind of rig it in such a way that you can't really overturn the establishment forces. And it may be that if there's enough corruption and if there's enough unfair play over a long enough time, that people just assume they don't really live in a democracy and don't really participate. And so you kind of see that with Malaysian youth voters. They're not really engaged because they don't really see it as, they don't see any point in it. And I suspect if you asked them, they might say that even if they did vote, even if they did start to pose a challenge to the government would just respond by changing the rules again in order to mitigate its losses, basically, in order to mitigate the opposition's gains. So if you expect the other party is just going to erase any gains you make, if you expect them to not maintain the trappings of a fair, liberal democratic institution, then why participate? It's a de facto authoritarian state, even if it's not actually, technically, an authoritarian state. And then Afghanistan also has elections nominally scheduled later this year, although they might get postponed again. They've been postponed several times already. I think they were originally supposed to happen last year. And that's a big mess because, the last elections, there was a big dispute about who the election winner was. And neither was willing to kind of concede the election. And so I think John Kerry, when he was still Secretary of State, this was under the Obama administration, had to fly in and negotiate a power-sharing deal, which was completely bizarre, because Afghanistan has a presidential political system, and in a presidential system, it's winner-take-all. You win the election, you're president. It's not like a parliamentary system where different parties can kind of come together and agree to share power in some way. So this power-sharing agreement basically saw the opposition leader, well, not opposition leader, but this other guy, basically one guy was given the presidency, and the other one was kind of hired as an advisor, quote-unquote. And he had certain rights and privileges that were not legal, technically, or not official, but that the president agreed to recognize. So basically, certain decisions that were made by this other guy had to be recognized as legal decisions. And that was a de facto solution, not a de jure solution. And the result has been confusion and misgovernance, and basically the Afghan government has never really been able to quite entirely get its shit together. There's just a lot of problems institutionally there. And the power sharing agreement really didn't do anything to solve any of those. In fact, it probably made them worse, if anything. And the overall result of this is that there's not a lot of confidence that the next elections are going to be much of an improvement. The next elections are parliamentary, not presidential. So there is some, it's not going to be like a big clusterfuck like last time, at least until the next presidential elections. But the parliamentary elections are expected to be not quite a shambles, but not to be particularly well organized either. There's parts of the country where the government doesn't even have a presence. There's parts of it where it kind of shares custody with the Taliban, and there's kind of violence everywhere, and there's still a warlords problem. There's a lot of local political elites, de facto warlords, who just kind of run the show, and they're going to get the votes, most likely. There's not like real political competition on the ground. It's almost a feudal system where local political elites kind of band together in different coalitions and try to divide the spoils of government, basically, between them. So those elections and kind of the circumstances around them don't lend a lot of confidence to the efficacy of the Afghan government, its ability to govern, or its ability to continue to kind of survive against ongoing pressure from the Taliban and warlords and other forces that kind of destabilize their political system there. The Afghan war is a whole conversation in and of itself. I won't get into that, but the Afghan elections are kind of a microcosm of some of the fundamental problems to the Afghan war strategy, such as it is. And then there was, who else? Iraq. We already talked about Iraq last week, so I kind of let that go. The big question there was how well the Shia militias would do. There was a number of Shia militias that ended up being created in response to the Islamic State crisis. And a lot of them are kind of running candidates in the new election. And it could be that if they do really well, that the government becomes more sectarian, because there's a perception that a lot of these militias are very sectarian Shia militias. At least that's the fear, certainly among Sunni population. But I've also read that they've actually Shia militias in Iraq have actually started to kind of get some converts from Sunni communities in northern Iraq in the places that they've taken. There have been abuses, definitely, but they've also gotten some converts, and they may have gone some way into easing some sectarian tension there by, well, not murdering as much as they thought they would, basically. Now, on the other hand, if the Shia militias don't do well in the elections, that kind of lends a little more hope to sectarian reconciliation in Iraq, and belief that the government will continue to be more autonomous. That's another thing. The Shia militias are kind of seen as being more aligned with Iran. So if the Shia militias do well, that would suggest Iran has more influence in the Iraqi government, whereas if they don't do as well, they have relatively less, and that improves the American hand in Iraq. I think we talked at length about how the United States kind of has limited leverage in Iraq, so anything would be beneficial in that regard. Let's see, beyond Iraq, there was, what, Mexico, Iraq, and Pakistan. Pakistan is also having elections, I think, in May. And that, I don't know how much is really going to change there. The current guy, the incumbent is nominally Nawaz al-Sharif. He was actually impeached, but he leads his party. He's kind of the head of the party patronage network. So even if he's not in power, he's effectively still in power, so long as his party's in power. And so I think it's the Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz is his party's name. They're the incumbent, and they're running for re-election. I think they've taken a bit of a hit to popularity because of the impeachment. But I think the conservatism definitely helps them, because it's a socially conservative party. It's basically the Republican Party in Pakistan. They're pro-business, but also socially conservative. That's kind of their platform. And Nawaz al-Sharif has made a whole career about using that platform to try to get power. Now, he doesn't really have a lot of opposition. I don't think the PPP is really pushing much. Has a lot of attraction. The PPP is the Pakistan People's Party. I hope I'm remembering that correctly. And they're kind of more of the leftist, center-left party in Pakistan. And I don't think they really have a lot of popularity right now. It's kind of seen as being traditionally corrupt, and there's just not a lot of movement there. Also, their patronage network kind of has eroded a bit with time. Yeah, patronage networks and your ability to kind of dole out political goods to your supporters is more important if you're in a political system like that in Pakistan. There's some ideological considerations, which party reflects my ideology, etc. But there's still a lot of poor people in Pakistan, and when you're poor, you don't really give a shit about ideology so much as you care about where your next meal is coming from. And if a politician comes and says, hey, I'll totally feed you if you vote for me, and you have to choose between that guy and somebody else who doesn't even know you exist, who are you going to vote for? You're going to vote for the guy who's going to feed you, probably. So that actually used to be the way it works in the United States. It's not just Pakistan. You can see that manifest in any number of countries over any given time period. So the PML in their principal rival is this guy who used to play cricket. He's like this famous sports star, a guy named Imran Khan, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing the name, but he was a big legendary sports star, I think in like the 70s or the 80s or so. And then, made a lot of money, so then he got involved in politics, and his only real platform was anti-corruption. And there's certainly a lot of corruption in Pakistan, so there is some appeal to that. But he was not a very finessed, skilled politician. He basically just came out and said, hi, I'm a famous guy, I'm against corruption, vote for me. Well, that's nice, but you need to do more than that. Again, you need to kind of engage in the political process. You need to kind of go out and engage people, constituents, recognize their individual needs, cater policy to those needs, go out, build out a patronage network. Ideally, you wouldn't have to build a patronage network to succeed in Pakistan's politics, but that's kind of where you're at. So you got to do something, either build a network or build a coalition with other parties that already have network. One or the other, pick your poison. And Imran Khan, for his part, has evolved considerably over the past 20 years. He's kind of getting better at politics, so to speak. And I think right now he's working on a coalition, not necessarily with parties, but with voters. He's trying to pull voters away from other parties by appealing to nationalists and appealing to social conservatives, which he had not really done before. Before he kind of mostly catered to the liberal urban crowd in Pakistan. That was kind of more his core constituency. Also some Pashtuns in the northwest, because they don't like the status quo. But he's come out and started to kind of appeal more to a broader demographic. He's been more socially conservative to try to appeal to those people. That's a powerful voting bank in Pakistan. And he's also tried to appeal to nationalists, by being, kind of anti-American and, critical of the international system, etc., the usual kind of thing. And so he's peeling some of that nationalist vote. I don't think he's going to get all of it. From what I've read, it seems like he's just going to get enough to kind of pose a threat. We'll kind of see if it matters, because another thing he's doing is kind of buttering up to the military. And in general, that's a good idea for political survival in Pakistan, because the Pakistani military is kind of the final arbiter of the nation's politics. It'll allow civilians to do some things. It'll give them some room to maneuver. But if the Pakistani military really decides it doesn't want you around, you're not going to be around very long. So the trouble with buttering up to the Pakistani military, though, is that it kind of suggests he's not going to be able to do a lot in terms of reform. A lot of the big blocks to economic and political reform in Pakistan kind of comes from the military. The military is willing to allow a fair amount of reform, but nothing that really challenges its power in the country. And that's a problem because the military has connections throughout Pakistan's economy and its local politics, such that it has an inordinate amount of influence, which would not be a problem in and of itself, if not for the fact that, as usual, when you get politics involved in economic decision-making, it tends to have a negative effect on economic performance. So a lot of companies, firms, economic interests that are owned by the military or indirectly owned by the military, a lot of them have effectively protectionist regimes in place that protect them and kind of serve to prevent them from really becoming competitive, and as a result serve as a drain on public finances. That's a problem. That's a problem for the Pakistani economy. And it's going to take some deep reforms that are probably going to curb the military's influence in Pakistan to kind of address that. And that's just one example of a structural issue in Pakistan. There's also, problems with the structure of the political system. There's problems with trends in voting. There's a lot of people who are not particularly liberal about democracy in Pakistan. There are more majoritarian Democrats. So, how do you deal with those people? How do you deal with developing Pakistan's institutions, the judicial and legislative institutions, such that they're a little something more than just kind of an extension of the military? There's plenty to reform in Pakistan if you want to. But Imran Khan kind of buttering up to the military suggests he's not really going to do too much of that. It may be that he's just kind of running more as a nominal reform candidate who changes superficial things, but is not really able to change too much of substance. Maybe he surprises people, maybe he wins election and kind of really makes some dramatic changes for the better, but it's kind of hard to see how he does that given the political capital he has to work with in terms of his political allies, his political opponents, his political strategy, his constituents, etc. The underlying calculus is not quite there to suggest a big, major change in policy direction. But I'm willing to accept that I could be wrong on that. I don't know everything there is to know about Pakistani politics. I'm interested to see how it plays out, basically. It's something to watch. Well, how's that? That's probably more than 5 minutes, though.
Yeah, but you got to round off a point. It's all good. Well, cool session. This was number 27. We covered this a couple times ago, that the episodes haven't been uploaded immediately after. I could potentially do that, like make it more regular. I think it would make sense to have one per week that's released. I just get like a backlog of tons of videos that I'm exporting, and I'm doing one per day.
No problem, man. I mean, they're all on Twitch. It's not like YouTube is particularly special. So yeah, you don't have to prioritize it. Don't go out of your way for it.
Yeah. Well, if you want it before it's on YouTube, just go to the Twitch page and then videos. Check out Agent Smith's Twitter page and his SoundCloud. Who is it? Thank you very much, Fuzzy Cord, for handling the questions.
Yes, thank you, Fuzzy Cord.
And yeah, we should be good to go for next week. I think the weekend of the 20th is kind of tentative, but I should be good for next week. But thanks so much for coming on. Always a good time having you. Great discussion today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was fun.
See you next time, fam.
Yep, see ya.
Nice. Okay, so real quick before I end the stream, I wanted to display this and set